And a really big welcome to Carbon Crunch 2023. And it's really wonderful to see so many senior leaders from across our industry in one room together. And so welcome everybody. Hope you have a great day. Recent news stories remind us all about the devastating impact of climate change. We only need to look at the really terrible floods in Libya and the raging wildfires in Hawaii and across the Mediterranean this summer. And on a smaller scale, the heat that we've probably all feeling this morning as you come out of the tube, which is totally abnormal for October in the UK. In our industry, we have the potential to make a real difference. But to harness that potential, we really need to collaborate more than ever before. That's why I believe Carbon Crunch is so vitally important for us. And that's why I'm really delighted to see not only a lot of senior leaders here, but senior leaders from across the whole breadth of the supply chain. None of us individually have the answers, but together, I think we do have the answers. And we need to join together to make sure that we can find the solutions, make the significant change that we need to, and go at the pace that we need to achieve net zero by 2050. Reducing emissions is only part of the challenge that we're all facing. Adapting our existing infrastructure to so it's fit for the future and also that it's climate resilient is a really key issue for us all. The most recent report from the Climate Change Committee on England's progress on adaptation highlighted concerns that the UK is strikingly unprepared. Recent weeks have shown that government policy may change and the landscape may change, but whatever current government policy is, it's obvious to me that the private sector have a critical role to play in delivering clear leadership and steering the right course on both decarbonisation and adaptation. This only goes to emphasise, I think, even more why Carbon Crunch is a really important event. We first launched it 10 years ago. In 2013, the inspiration was for Carbon Crunch was the publication of the Infrastructure Carbon Review, which, among other things, identified effective leadership as critical to delivering carbon reduction. The document firmly placed clients in the driving seat and gave everybody else in the supply chain a clear responsibility to deliver on decarbonisation too. The Infrastructure Carbon Review set out that cutting carbon is not just important to slowing the rate of climate change, there's a compelling business case to it as well. So essentially, done right, it can be a win-win situation. Carbon Crunch brings together senior leaders from across the built environment to put us all in the best possible place to learn, to engage and support each other on the path to net zero and climate adaptation. When I opened Carbon Crunch last year, our focus was on the launch of PAS 2080, the leading standard for carbon management solutions in building and infrastructure development. I'm delighted to say that the final standard was published in April this year, and today's agenda includes an update on the standard and how we need to all apply it in our work. The rest of the lineup today brings together the industry's leading experts to provide the latest insight and thinking, as well as practical examples of how the sector is making progress on the path to net zero. It also addresses the need for climate adaptation. Looking over the agenda today makes me feel optimistic about our ability to decarbonise and build in climate resilience. It's not easy, but I do think it is possible. We've made huge strides over the last 10 years, and these continue every day. For example, we all know that measuring the effectiveness of our work is critical. We need to measure where we are at the moment and the baseline for us to be able to then identify where we're going to get the greatest impact from the things that we do and the greatest potential to reduce carbon and do it at a faster pace than we've ever done before. It's for that reason that I'm really delighted to see the launch of the Built Environment Carbon Database, BECD for short. It's a free-to-access carbon database for buildings and infrastructure. It's owned by the Building Cost Information Service, who are specialists in collecting, collating, analysing, modelling and interpreting cost information. And I'm very, very pleased that Mott MacDonald are the first company to share our proprietary carbon data through the database. And of course, that's with the full backing of our clients. The BECD contains a substantial body of infrastructure carbon data harvested from our highways projects that aim to establish a baseline of embodied carbon across the industry. The plan is for BECD to expand to other sectors in the built environment, but right now the database allows you to look at the carbon cost of a typical roundabout, flyover and so on, rather than just a single figure for an overall project. So it's broken down to a different level of granularity. And that's what differentiates it from other carbon calculations, as it's based on built assets rather than projections from design stage. As James Fisk, the CEO of BCIS, has said, the only way we can be sure that we're making the right decisions to reduce environmental impact of our activities in the built environment is to learn from and share data with each other. To make BECD even more impactful, we ask for your support of every organisation in this room to share your figures with the database, to make the benchmarking even more effective and more accurate and enable us all to use it. By sharing data, it's going to be truly possible to see how our designs measure up when it comes to moving the dial on carbon reduction. Getting to net zero is a shared responsibility, and it would be really significant if everybody participates in this initiative. That just leaves me to say that I hope you really enjoy this year's Carbon Crunch and come away feeling inspired, not depressed, and having made new connections, and that will really aid you in your work day in, day out on driving carbon down in the built environment and in building climate resilience. Thank you.
Thanks, Cathy. That was great. Really good scene setter for us for the rest of the day. One of the things that strikes me, and this isn't my first carbon crunch, I'm sure there are people in the room who can, if we were to put your hand up and count down from 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, I'm sure there'll be a number of you who've been here for a number of times. I'm just looking, you know who I'm looking at. But anyway, I felt like it's a really business-like, really practical session that we've got ahead of us today, and Cathy set that out perfectly. I'm Denise Barr, I'm a Group Board Director at Mott MacDonald, and I'll be chairing the event along with some of my colleagues who you'll meet as the morning goes along. My job, first of all, though, today is to welcome Lord Deben. Really pleased that he's agreed to give our keynote address today. Lord Deben was chair of the UK's Independent Climate Change Committee until July this year. And during his 11 years in that role, 11 years, he played an integral part in the UK setting ambitious climate commitments and in holding ministers to account for progress in cutting emissions. Lord Deben has been a prominent parliamentarian for more than 5 decades, since he first became an elected MP in 1970. Wow. Over the course of his political career, he's held many, many important roles, including as the longest-serving Secretary of State for the Environment that the UK has ever had. He introduced the groundbreaking Environment Act in 1995, which established the Environment Agency and established new standards for environmental management. He also introduced the landfill tax in 1996, which was the UK's first environmental tax. He was twice awarded the title Parliamentarian Who Did the Most for Environment internationally by the BBC. I'll be back following Lord Deben's address, but in the meantime, please welcome me in joining Lord Deben to the stage.
Well, thank you very much. Apart from 16 years as a government minister, I've spent my life as a businessman. And I therefore recognise that the most important thing in business is to discover those few things that are certain, because most things are uncertain, and we spend our lives dealing with the uncertainties, the things that come in that you never actually thought were going to come in, and they're the ones that can so easily turn the business upside down. But it is quite a good idea, at least, to start off by deciding what is actually certain. And climate change is certain. There is no question that every year, whatever we do, it'll get worse in our lifetime. Now, the crucially important bit about that is that businesses really cannot operate unless they accept the certainties, because the uncertainties are the ones that you've got to concentrate on. And when I started Sancroft, which is the company I chair, 26 years ago, the thing I was trying to get people to understand was that the issues of sustainability more generally, and increasingly climate change more centrally, are advantages if you take them right. And they only become disadvantages if you start from the assumption, oh my goodness me, we've got another incubus, there's something more I've got to pay for. And in those days it was perfectly true. Everybody thought sustainability was a cost. And then I met the chairman of Coca-Cola one day. We worked for Coca-Cola over many, many years. And he said to me, he said, John, he said, what I mean about sustainability is that I want to be here in 125 years like I've been here for 125 years. The fundamental issue of sustainability is actually to make the business continue. And the things which will enable that to happen, the recognition of the world that we now live in. And at the heart of that is a world which every year will be affected by climate change. And I think what Cathy said in her introduction was a wonderful setting for it, because that is exactly what's happened. And if you look at what's happened in Scotland, where a month's rain falls in 24 hours, you realise that the infrastructure which we have created is incapable of handling the new kind of weather. I had a piece of real luck. last year, I was rifling through the books which were on sale in our parish church's sale. You know, we all go to the fete, and I looked through these books, and there was a book written by an American serviceman in 1945. He'd come right at the end of the war, the first time he'd ever been abroad. He'd come from the back of beyond, somewhere in Alabama, and he'd come to Britain. And he wrote this fascinating little book about what it was like to come to Britain for the first time. And in it, he talks about the weather. This is in East Anglia. He came to Suffolk. He talks about the weather. He says it's wonderful in Britain because you don't have the rain coming down in great downpours. You have soft, refreshing rain through the year. And then he said, and you know, we don't have those witheringly hot summers that we have in America. You have just gentle warmth for much of July and August. That was in 1945. It could not be further from the truth in 2023. And that's the thing we have to remember, how rapidly all this has changed. When I started gardening, because I'm so old, when I started gardening, spring came 17 days later than it does now. And any gardener, if you've got some right-wing individual you've got to have a go at, start with gardening, because they know, the one thing they know is that the garden is different. And the blooming flowers come out before the pollinators. So we've actually interrupted that system which gives us life. It's absolutely fundamental. And the problem we have is that we fail to recognize the inherent connection between creating resilience now and mitigating for the future. Those two things need to come together. And the resilience bit is pathetic in this country because governments will not face up to the realities. I'm not excusing any government, and I don't think it's necessarily true that if you change the government you get anything much better, because people are always under these pressures. If you noticed, when the Labour Party absolutely rightly said we're not going to have new oil fields and coal mines in the 2030s, we're not going to do that. The first two sets of people who attacked them were their two biggest donors, the two biggest unions who give them money. So they are in the same position of any government. The pressures that come not to do things you ought to do for the future, but to do things which are convenient at the moment. And when you think of Rishi Sunak's ridiculous statement that he wasn't going to have 7 bins, no one ever suggested we'd have 7 bins. When he said we're not going to force people to carry more people in their cars. No one's ever suggested that. But it's all part of the inability of politicians, of all political parties, to recognise that we have actually got to face the public with the realities. Because if we don't, they will face us with them. When those terrible floods took place a few years ago in Germany, for the very first time, you heard the local people saying, why has the government not done enough about climate change? People aren't foolish. They can put things off like all the rest of us. But when it comes to it, they know that those changes are taking place. And of course, we've got to do it in a just way. Of course, we've got to do it in a sensible way. Of course, we've got to make sure that we take as many people with us as we can. But what we must not do is to refuse to accept the realities. And it's that business surely ought to accept first, because business needs to face those facts, otherwise it won't be in business. And interestingly, in what Cathy said at the beginning, she talked about supply chain. Because what we have to remember is that the supply chain is impacted by climate change in an enormous way. COVID brought the problems of the supply chain very sharply to view. We found in Sancroft a whole lot of people who were our clients who really didn't know about their supply chain properly at all. And now that one has got to deal with the category 3 emissions, they're beginning to discover there are people in the supply chain who are crucial to them, but they haven't really thought about it. So that is a business imperative which you here have got to play a big part in it, because your supply chains are particularly difficult and complicated. Coca-Cola, I remember, allows me to say this, but they couldn't send out their 6-packs in Japan during COVID because they got everything right. They've got other sources for everything except the glue. And the glue came from somewhere near Wuhan. So one just has to see that even the best find this very difficult. And the supply chain is going to be a crucial part of what we do in order to make sure about resilience. And the problem with climate change, it's not just direct. It's not just about flooding factories or making it impossible for people to produce directly. It's the indirect effects too, because more and more of the world will be disrupted by climate change. I remember the moment when that really came home to me in the House of Lords, when a very sensible question from that remarkable man, Lord Alton, about the invasion of Christian villages by Muslims, other villages, when the minister, of course, said how appalling this was and how dreadful it was, but she then finished by saying, but we have to remember that because of climate change, those Muslim villages had no water and the Christian villages had water. And the excuse of religion enabled them to provide water for their children. That is what climate change will do. It will be constantly disruptive, and it will be disruptive indirectly as well as directly, and we have to recognise that. And that's why I do think all these things about migrants are so distressing, because this government has got to learn that the problems we've got about migration today are nothing like the problems we are going to have, because temperatures rising as they do, it's not a question of people moving for a better life. It will be people moving for a life, because you can't live if the temperatures are 50 degrees centigrade. And that's what's happening in places like Niamey in Niger. And they're moving into Morocco. And Morocco is pushing the Moroccans into Spain. And if you look at the situation, we talk about our immigration, my goodness, the Italians can talk about it. And the Greeks have islands filled with people because of the pressures which are enhanced and extended by climate change. So we are in a situation in which we have to recognise the resilience we talk about is a very large question about railway lines which have got to be able to withstand temperatures which they were never built for. Road surfaces which become impossible because of the heat. All sorts of things we haven't thought about in Britain have got to be thought about, which is why the Climate Change Committee was so absolutely appalled by the government's 5-year plan, which took none of this into account. It was just a bit of fiddling at the edges. And yet, month by month, we see this, all of us, and we know we have to make those pressures and we have to meet it ourselves, because in the end the government will have to do it. The thing that is at least certain is that they may be pathetic in doing it and slow in doing it, and the opposition may not be brave enough, but the fact of the matter is, in the end, the realities of life will force it. And it'll be more expensive, more difficult, and you're going to have to deliver it. I'm afraid that is the fact of life. So net zero is what we are aiming at. And there was just one thing, Cathy, that I do think one has to say about net zero, as well as the very sensible things you said, which is that both words matter, net and zero. That the zero is about bringing down the emissions to the very lowest we can. The net is recognising that one of the things that we've done is to make it less possible for the earth and the sea to take in the carbon. And we therefore have got to make the world more resilient. And in the work that your industry does, of course, enabling the earth to do its job properly and the seas to do their job properly is a hugely important part of your planning and the way that you deal with the environment. And so there are, I think, 3 things I want to leave you with. First of all, you need to use your professionalism. You've come here because you know that your professionalism demands an understanding of climate change, of what that means for your businesses, what it means for your clients, what it means right the way down the supply chain. But the fascinating thing for me, because I've been around so long, is the huge change among engineers in particular. I remember when engineers were conquerors. They went out there and drove things through and built things over and found an answer to impose things. And what's happened in 50 years is the move to an understanding that we actually have to work with the Earth, with the planet. Now, most of you will be surprised at what I'm just about to say, but the best piece of reading you could do today is just to look up on the internet and see the latest letter of Pope Francis. It's called Laudatum Deum. It's the follow-up to his Laudato Si, the great encyclical 8 years ago. And you don't need to be religious. You just need to, it's the most wonderful summing up of the stupid position we've got ourselves into and what we have to do. It's short, sharp, and frighteningly true, and well worth looking up and just reading, because it just puts the whole thing into a proper context of saying this is the world we live in, and if we want our children to live in a world anything like this, we actually have to make some fundamental changes in the way in which that first bit of your rather nice noise and music as we started says. And it's your professionalism which we will rely on to deliver that. And then there's the question of how you influence politics. I know it's a kind of improper conversation in a meeting like this, but I'm going to shock you even more than that. I want to ask a simple question. Will everybody who has been in touch with their local member of parliament on climate change during the last 6 months put their hands up? Well, you've beaten every audience I've spoken to in the last 3 weeks. Brilliant. But it's only 9 out of this. Now, the point is, members of parliament only listen to their constituents. And in this year of an election, when more people don't know how they're going to vote than any period that I've ever thought of, heard of before, this is the moment to get this in. So I beg of you to get on and go to see your member of parliament and talk about it from your professional understanding. This is what I have to do. These are the things that are happening. This is how my business has to change. This is what my customers think. And you do that. You ring up and get an appointment, and they'll always ask you what it's for, and the answer is don't tell them. Tell them that it's a personal matter between you and the member of parliament, because then they won't find an excuse that he hasn't got time or she hasn't got time. But I want everybody around the country to do that, because if you do that, we will get a change. There are many good members of parliament in all parties that really care about this. But there are bad ones in all parties too. There's one member of parliament, the Labour Party, who's actually a member of the Climate Change Fund, the anti-climate change organisation. And yet he's standing there, and I want every Labour voter to give him what for on it, because this is what has to happen. And there are lots of Tories and Liberal Democrats in the same position. So it's really important for that to happen, because you professionally need that. Because the government, the quicker the government moves, the cheaper and the better it is for you. And we've got to reclaim democracy, because otherwise Just Stop Oil will be right. Because what they're saying is the democratic system doesn't work fast enough to do what we have to do. So we all have a duty, and it's part of our professionalism. And because we're professional, we can say things which no one else can say, and we can convince in a way which no one else can convince. So please, everybody, and thank you for the 9, that is remarkable, and I shall put that down because it is too good. And I want to end just on one other thing. When I meet when I meet leaders of business, as I do, as in Sancroft, we're working with people right across the board. There comes a moment when we've talked about the business, we've talked about how we deal with sustainability, we've talked about climate change, we've talked about the supply chain, we've done all that. And then I want to talk about him or her. Because in the end, we have to be the leaders as individuals in what we do, how we act. I did a platform with down in Surrey for the Surrey Commission on Climate Change. And one of the other speakers was Natalie Bennett, the ex-leader of the Green Party, with whom I don't agree very often. Anyway, she said something which appalled me. She said, I don't care what people do individually, it's all systemic change we need. That is absolute nonsense, because nobody listens to a business unless it does it itself. And nobody in a business listens to any one of us unless we do it ourselves. And what climate change is challenging us is to think ourselves of how we as individuals are going to act, because our grandchildren are going to ask us, and what did you do in the war, Daddy, Mummy? That's what they're going to ask. And it's a pretty tough question for any of us here. So I finish by saying it starts with us as individuals. It moves on to us in the democratic structure in which we live, making sure that politicians of all kinds and the organisations we belong to, whether it's Rotary or the church or whatever it is, are doing these things as well. And then it is fundamentally and crucially about our businesses and the way in which we use our expertise in order to make this country more resilient, because it has to be, and then mitigate climate change so that we can control the amount of heat that arises. Just think how awful has been the effect of 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial heat, and think that we are at the moment on course for 3.5. That is not a world in which any of us can live, and that's why all this matters and why we've come to the carbon crunch. See, I've even done what she told me to do before and moved over.
Everybody does what I tell them to do. Thank you ever so much. I don't really know where to start, and we've only got 4 minutes for questions, which have been canvassed both from the room and online as well, because we have an online audience of a couple of hundred people who I should have probably welcomed earlier to the session. Businesses, infrastructure, we're often seen at odds with climate action and biodiversity. You talked about gardening, and clearly, you know, you're sat in front of a very nice green display in the room here to remind us about the importance of biodiversity. What's your perception of the key successes delivered by infrastructure in reducing carbon, and what would you like to see more of in terms of restoring the balance of nature?
Well, I think it's just making decisions through that lens all the time, thinking about it and thinking about new ways of doing it and being conscious all the time and recognising, you know, we've been so foolish about nature. Victorians were actually curious enough, better about it. All those Victorian parks, they knew people needed. They needed the air and needed those places. And London is amazing because of that very thing. And we know also that plant enough trees and you're actually not just taking in carbon, but you're actually lowering the heat. Crucially important to plant urban trees, but also when roads are built or resurfaced. It's not just the surfacing which has got to face the new heat, but it's also the use of the sides. I mean, some roads you see, and people have really gone into sensible treatment of it so that you've actually increased the biodiversity, and you don't have a lot of straggling trees which have been planted and going to die. I don't ever talk about planting more trees. I talk about looking after more trees, because the planting doesn't help if you don't look after them.
No, I completely agree. I think one of the other benefits, as you were sort of alluding to there, is the resilience, the increased resilience you can get from the shading effect of trees over railway lines, roads and so on. And you talked about resilience sort of throughout your opening remarks. We can't afford to have everything working all the time, can we? You know, the scale of the challenge we're faced with, as you so clearly articulated, is quite staggering. How do we go about having a conversation about what an acceptable level of failure is in our services?
Well, I don't think you can start from that end. I think you have to say, look, this is a battle which human ingenuity can overcome. Now we know, because that's what makes us responsible, we know what's happening, and we can find a way of dealing with it. And we want to deal with it in a way which does, in fact, ensure that the lights don't go off, to take it at its extreme. And therefore, we have to argue what we're doing on that basis. We have to say, we're doing this in order that the lights won't go off. And you can get people on side if you say that. If you say, well, we're going to sort of half do it, and therefore your lights might go off, I'm sorry, people are not going to, that's not a battle we're going to win. But we do have to say to people some things. I mean, it's ludicrous, you won't like this, it's ludicrous that we've still got a road building programme of the kind. The idea that we're really going to spend money putting a tunnel underneath the Stonehenge, I mean, I know you'd love to do it and all that, but the fact of the matter is, it's a really bad use of money. And we've really got to better, I mean, I happen not to agree with the government on HS2, but that's a different issue. All I'm saying is we've got to look at these things. And one of the things is, if you build more roads, you have more traffic. And there is no question about that. And you really have to behave in a different way. And that's the sort of thing, but you've got to do it in the way in which you say we're going to make things better, not make things worse. And therefore you do these things, and the Treasury hates this. Above all, you use hypothecation. You say, if you pay for that, that's what comes. At the moment you say, if you pay that, it goes into the Treasury and you never see it again. What you need to have, that's why the landfill tax was such a success, because half the money was used for improving the environment locally. And that's what people cared about. And therefore they didn't mind the tax. Then in came the new government, happened to be a Labour government. Labour government came in and they took the money away. So it's not just Tories.
Gosh, on that note.
There's somebody over there who's desperate.
Oh no, the red card is saying that we're out of
time.
Well,
you've got 40 seconds.
Only to walk over there. And thank you very much for joining us today. Please join me in thanking Lord Deben. We are over jam-packed in our agenda today, which is why that I couldn't go on and why a red card was being waved at me from the back of the room. There's so much to talk about on this topic that we could go on for days, couldn't we? So rather than building in Q&As, we've arranged plenty of networking time over tea and coffee. There's networking over lunch afterwards where you can share ideas with your colleagues. What I'm going to do now is hand over to our next speaker, Maria Manidaki, who's well known to many of you in the room, no doubt. She's our Technical Director for Carbon Net Zero and the co-author of PAS 2080. Maria, I'm sure you've got views on some of what you've just heard as well, but I'm going to hand over to you. Maria, welcome to the stage. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Hi, I'm Maria. Thank you, Denise. Fascinating speech. by the way, yeah, hands up. So today, I just want to touch a little bit about systems. We keep hearing about systems. We keep hearing about past 2080. So what are all these things about, and how does it relate to us in the room being involved in buildings and infrastructure? The first thing I want to say, if you don't know past 2080, please have a look. I mean, I was a member in the technical author team between Mott MacDonald and Arup. We published earlier in the year. And please have a look at especially the guidance document that has some really good practical case studies. So when we're talking about systems in the terms of past 2080, this is a definition from past 2080. But yeah, it's essentially collection, interconnection of physical facilities and human interactions. No. This diagram on the left-hand side is from the Center of Digital Build Britain. You've seen it before, hopefully. But the key message here is that a system is essentially a very complex ecosystem of relationships, of assets, nature, people, and other more esoteric things. So we really struggled when we were talking about past 2080 and introducing the concept of systems for decarbonization and co-benefits with resilience, with nature, of what exactly does it mean for us delivering projects and programs of work in the built environment. So this is a diagram from past 2080. If we look at the right-hand side, all I want to introduce is the fact that the past recognizes there is a nested relationship between assets, networks, and systems. An asset can be a building, can be a bridge, can be a pumping station, a pipeline. A network can be a building development, or it can be the water, wastewater network, or the road network, or a rail network. And a system could be a sector of infrastructure like transport, water, it could be a geography, a city. We're having a cities panel a bit later. But the whole point here is that traditionally we have been focusing on decarbonizing and reducing capital operational carbon at the asset level, because that's more practical when we understand it like that better. So we have a target at the asset level and let's go for it. But the past recognizes all the complexities around achieving net zero and meeting other outcomes as well that are really important for any system, is that focusing on a specific asset will not take us to net zero, no way. So we need to start looking a little bit upwards. On the left-hand side, what the PAS shows in this diagram is essentially the different value chain members in different colors here that are involved in one way or another in planning and delivering buildings and infrastructure projects and programs of work, which can happen, by the way, in any part of this triangle. And what it also shows is that these people, from asset owners, managers, constructors, designers, product material suppliers, you see government regulators, investors up there as well, where the PAS gives more specific guidance. You see that these people have got different levels of direct control of emissions in each of those levels, but also the PAS recognizes that they can influence things in a big way. So it's not about just, let's say I'm a designer or an asset owner. I'm not just going to have to wait for government to tell me what to do. I can still do things and influence the wider system, but the people who have more direct control from a policy perspective could be government regulators, multiple asset owners, etc. So this is, it's quite complex, but the whole thing is like, okay, so what exactly does this mean? And if you ask me, I mean, I find when I hear of systems, I visualize, you know, these dots and the bubbles and the links and all this stuff, which is great, but it's a little bit esoteric for me. I mean, I'm an engineer by background. What does this mean? So if I'm any member of the value chain, what does a system practically approach mean for me, and especially for decarbonization, which is quite hard to achieve? So I wanted to try and deconstruct this challenge. I'm not going to give you solutions, I think, perhaps some examples, but perhaps some food for thought. So the way we went about this was under 3 different angles in the PAS team and from discussions with different stakeholders in our industry, from different value chain members. Why is it hard? So a quick glimpse of the great work of our colleagues at the Committee for Climate Change. This is from the 6th Carbon Budget. You've all seen this diagram. I'm not going to go too much detail. Essentially, this is a snapshot of the balanced pathway for the UK to achieve net zero by 2050. And there are different actions and recommendations and trajectories from different sectors of the economy, from a UK PLC point of view, of what needs to happen by when. Okay, great. This is not simple, by the way. Yes, I know we have people from the CC here. Very sophisticated piece of work. Great. Okay, so if I'm a sector of the economy, if I'm an asset owner, if I'm whoever member of the value chain, what exactly does this mean for me? And one of the things I wanted to discuss here is this has been triggered from it's a conceptual diagram that has been triggered by some conversations ongoing in our water sector in the UK, especially in the last year, 18 months. Please, this is just purely dummy data, but we have been discussing with water companies, with some of our regulators, government. When I mean government, I mean DEFRA and our colleagues in business, back then BASE. It's just to understand, okay, so we know as a sector, we are having to build loads of things in the next 25, 30 years to meet some regulatory requirements from the Environment Act, meaning and climate hazards. Like we know in the UK, there is a big program of major strategic water resource options we need to account for to face the future climate risks of drought for water supply. So this, we're talking about big infrastructure projects. At the same time, we need to sort out our stormwater overflows. Yeah, so we've seen it all over the news. At the same time, we need to integrate more nature-based solutions. At the same time, we need to decarbonize our own operations and our supply chain, scope 1, 2, 3. And at the same time, we have an idea of a target as a sector for our operational emissions, at least from our water sector commitment to 2030. But then we don't really have an agreed trajectory of how to translate the UK pathways work that the CCC has done into what it means for us, which is the red line. So all these different bits you're seeing here, the different colors, are essentially representing a number of scenarios. So if you have to build all these things to meet the outcomes, there is no way you're going to be underneath that red line, the trajectory, which is the hypothetical, if you like, arbitrarily applied 6 carbon budget balance pathway to our water sector. And this is that top-down view, which is the fact that the system, which is the biggest challenge and the biggest gap we have in any country in the world, that we haven't been looking at decarbonization and other outcomes more systemically, top-down. That's why the arrow's pointing downwards, to understand what types of interventions we need to have in our asset base, if you like, in the lower levels of the triangle. And for me, this is the most complicated thing that requires more kind of strategic dialogue that is evidence-based with our regulators, our governments, our multiple asset owners in the system. Going to the guidance document of the past 2080, I'm trying to advertise a little bit here. So please have a look. This is one example of a case study, some study done in the buildings world by Sheffield University and UCL. It's exactly a similar concept. So they took the building stock in England and they tried to understand, okay, so how can we meet the CCC budget, carbon budget in the building stock in England by having different interventions here, from wall insulation, double glazing, air source heat pumps. And the main solutions that are under this line are essentially the ground source heat pumps and air source heat pumps. Anything else will not get you to the budget. And this is a more clearly defined budget. And what it takes me here is to continue the story from this top-down challenge, is the fact that mainly we operate on the right-hand side where we have a project, we have a baseline, we have a target to meet, but how do we know these targets are aligned to a geographical system or sectoral system? This is a very, very complex issue that we need to address. This is another example from the guidance document. I just want to build the point that Lord Deben also mentioned. This is the example, classic example of interdependency mapping in urban planning, Atlanta versus Barcelona. The members in our TA team for past 2080 were very passionate to include that study done by UCL, where 5 million population cities, and essentially you can see the difference in urban planning, how dense the buildings are and the people live, how close, and having efficient transport corridors means that the per capita carbon emissions are an order of magnitude, like almost a bigger order of magnitude. Atlanta is about 7 tons per person and Barcelona is just over 1. So that systems thinking is really required to unlock things. The second angle I wanted to make quite quickly, this is good news, yeah? Not everything is doomed here. So we have many people in the audience here that they focus on major assets, being buildings or infrastructure. And they have shown us, and we have some great case studies that you can find in the guidance document from HS2, Anglian Water, other utilities and developments, where essentially you're taking an asset that you have confirmed their need to be built. Need could be questionable and it can be very political, like HS2, for example, or a reservoir or a pipeline. And then you take a systems approach of how to essentially unlock further decarbonization in the wider system. Yeah, so you take the bottom-up approach to this. So, for example, in the guidance document case studies, we have some case studies from Anglian Water where they look at exporting waste heat from some of the wastewater treatment works and transfer it to a tomato greenhouse over there, which is basically helping decarbonize their own operations. Or we have HS2, some studies that were presented to Parliament to see what is the benefit of emissions by removing freight from the road to electrified railway. So the message here, which is great, all the work that has been done, is that the systems approach pushing upwards is still the right thing to do. And the last angle I wanted to take was essentially looking at our supply chain that Lord Deben mentioned as well, as an ecosystem. One of the biggest challenges I mentioned earlier is for us needing to build stuff, loads of things to help with meeting various outcomes. Even in the energy sector, the energy transition requires loads of things to be built, from wind farms to solar farms to hydrogen facilities. And all these scope 3 emissions require quite a lot of materials, rely on very complex supply chains that come from all over the world, even from territories that we don't even know whether they have any decarbonization targets. So this angle of the system challenge is about how do we, as the value chain, asset owners, designers, constructors, product material suppliers, how do we actually mobilize a certain ecosystem in our supply chain to accelerate change and try and work out and trace where all these emissions are that we can control and how to reduce them so we can hopefully be under the line, which is a bit tricky. So one example here I gave, there are various industry initiatives, especially in the concrete and steel industry. In the UK, this is a snapshot from the low carbon route map, concrete route map, that was sponsored by the Green Construction Board and the Institution of Civil Engineers. There is a lot of activity in the infrastructure client group that a few of you are there, which is about saying, okay, what can the concrete industry do together, mobilizing all these global supply chains to come up with alternative products, becoming more efficient, etc. And the question always back is, okay, who pays for this if it's more expensive? And is there anything we can do as an industry then, using the buying power, the massive buying power, if you collect many of the big asset owners in buildings and infrastructure, to pre-order some of these things and have the right mechanisms in the contract? And this is quite interesting to see. That's why I put it here. The other thing to note when you're talking about scope 3 emissions and capital carbon is that any national target is under a territorial basis, which means anything we import, it's not really counting in our national target, which is, again, is it the right thing to do? What our leading organizations are doing. And lastly, I just wanted to leave you, again, this is from past 28 guidance document, have a look, please. What I want to leave you with is, again, you see all these boxes of the different value chain members. It's all about, I know we keep talking about collaboration, we need to collaborate, but the question is when and how, in order to really tackle this system challenge and find together a solution. It's hard. If you ask me, I don't have the answers, but yeah, hopefully there are enough people and brains in this room to make it happen. All I want to say before I go is that we're planning to do a deeper dive in some of these concepts in some clinics we're organizing end of November as a breakfast session, and it would be great to invite you to these if you're interested on systems. And that's it from me. I think I'm on time. Yeah, great. Thank you.
As I said, because we're having to press on, your opportunity to ask Maria questions on any of that will be over the coffee break, which will come up after the next session. So I'm now going to hand over to Clare Wildfire. Clare's our global practice leader for cities, and there was a perfect hook, Clare, in there for you from Maria with the Atlanta-Barcelona comparison, wasn't there? So Clare, come on up, and I believe you're chairing a panel session with some city and business leaders. Thanks, Clare.
Thank you. And panel members, could I invite you to also come up onto the stage, take your seats? You were the last to be mic'd up, weren't you? But you were all sorted. Good. Okay, I think I'll sit here, and then if you sit. So what I'm going to do a very quick context building, then I'll ask our guests to introduce themselves, and then we're going to get right on to the questions. So make sure, good thing, this clicker is giving really clear instructions. Right, I know what's happening next. Okay, so I am so pleased to be bringing the cities conversation to Carbon Crunch, because whilst we know that the national agenda and the big infrastructure programs are crucial in achieving our net zero journey, there's growing realization that there's no way that we're going to get to the answer we want without getting it right in cities, not least because globally cities are responsible for over 70% of carbon emissions, but also because a lot of the stuff that we're responsible for is happening in cities in this sort of, I think about it as a concentrated sort of swirling mass of interconnected things that and systems that we deal with. And what we know is to get to the answer we want, we're going to have action from business, from citizens, and cities have the influence and the ability to deliver some of that or convene the conversations that enable those participants to achieve the action. Mott MacDonald, we are engaged and support a lot of change in cities around the world. And because we really wanted to understand the role of cities in the climate change agenda, in 2021, we produced a report on behalf of the Net Zero Infrastructure Industry Coalition, which we co-founded in 2019, which was another of those actions where we're believing that our industry has so many of the answers to help us achieve the result we want. So we produced this report, and it recommended a 4-pillar approach to this sort of place-based approach to net zero, which is powers, partnerships, data platforms, and people. And very quickly, so on the power side, cities do need to be empowered to bring the changes and deliver the low carbon interventions and climate resilience where they are best placed to do so. They can harness the partnerships and therefore help deliver the change, bring the local investment, deliver the local benefits that aren't always visible through a national lens. And that then brings me to the third, the data platforms piece, because data insights are really crucial in that conversation, not just to track the progress, but also to be able to prove that there are co-benefits, that this isn't just about beneficial environmental change, that we also can bring social benefits and economic benefits. So healthier lifestyles come with some of the changes that we want to happen, and also economic benefits like green jobs. And then the final part of the conversation, the 4-pillar approach, is bringing the citizens into the conversation. So Lord Deben mentioned the fact that we've got to be honest with the electorate and the citizens. And for me, this is about helping people see that there are different versions of the future that could play out, and then helping them see what their role is in driving the future that we all want. So that it wasn't rocket science what came out in that report, but even though the context of it was net zero, for me, I'm still living off the back of that report because it's so relevant to the biodiversity crisis, to climate resilience. And just wanted to give a quick shout out to a couple of my co-authors on that report that I noticed are in the room. So Luke Strickland and Tom Dolan. So Luke's from Mott MacDonald, Tom's from UCL. So just feel good about yourselves, guys. Right, so now on to the conversation. So let's start with introductions, and if I can hand over to you to so Mark, introduce yourself, and we'll go down the line.
Yeah, certainly. Hi everyone, I'm Mark Daniels. I'm from E.ON UK. I'm the commercial director of our solutions business. So we've brought together in the UK all of our different solutions capabilities, be that district heating networks, working with large businesses, to selling individual solar panels to residential customers. But for the purpose of this panel, I also lead our city transformation team, leading on our larger city partnerships.
Good morning. My name's John Alexander. I'm the leader of the city of Dundee, the 4th largest city in Scotland, but by London standards, a very small village in comparison. But probably, again, for the purposes of today, and more of relevance to the conversation that we're having, I'm also chairman of an organisation called the Scottish Cities Alliance, which represents all 8 of Scotland's cities, so 3/4 of the population, 3/4 of the economy, and a really important vehicle for taking forward the conversations that we're having around this agenda.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tom Ross. I'm the leader of Trafford Council. For those that don't know Trafford, it's one of the 10 districts that forms Greater Manchester. And the main reason I'm here is I am the portfolio holder for GM Green City as part of the Greater Manchester Combined Authority.
Hello everyone, I'm Sarah Hayes. I'm an independent consultant and I'm an ambassador for Connected Places Catapult. For the last few years, I've been involved in Credo, the climate resilience demonstrator, which shares data across energy, water and telecoms networks to increase resilience across the infrastructure system. And I'm really interested to see and to understand more about how data and digital twins can help us mitigate and adapt to climate change.
Thank you. And the great thing is that we have representatives to have a conversation about cities from both the public sector and the private sector. So I'm looking forward to it. And just to mention actually that our 5th panel member, Steve Turner from 3CI, unfortunately had to pull out at the last minute, but we're going to try and fill the gap and represent 3CI as well in the conversation, because that's a fascinating sort of angle on the finance side. But I'm going to start with John, because historically cities have tended to compete with each other for national funding, for local investment, for growth. But in this sort of uncharted territory of having to do things that we've never done before, I think the balance of maybe working together is a really important one. So in the Scottish Cities Alliance, we were talking about the fact that you really have managed to help the cities work together. So can you share more?
Yeah, absolutely. The Alliance has been in operation since 2011. I've been chair for the last 6 years. And it is unique in many ways. It's unique in terms of the nature of the collaboration that takes place across those 8 urban environments. But perhaps more unique in a political arena is there has not been a single disagreement in those 6 years that I've been involved, certainly. And that is despite the fact that we are diverse in our political makeup, it's fair to say. And the nature of those conversations that take place are very focused on a clear agenda, and that's one way of bringing people together. So we don't talk about everything that affects local government. We have a very focused outlook on particular issues around net zero, for example, investment opportunities, and some other key thematic pieces of work. Now, I don't think anybody would expect me to say that we don't compete. We do compete. Of course we do. Individual cities have their own vested interests. They have their own aspirations and their own agendas to work towards. But on the agreed pieces of work that we take forward on an annual basis and we update on an annual basis, there is broad consensus across those 8 localities about the areas in which we collaborate and also how we take that collaboration forward. So we divide and conquer. It isn't a case that all 8 cities will do the same piece of work at the same time. We have a number of thematic programs, as I've mentioned. So, for example, one of those is around hydrogen. Aberdeen has been the leader in that, as you would expect, given the kind of transition away from oil and gas and the expertise that resides within Aberdeen. That knowledge, that data, that investment that has been focused and spearheaded by Aberdeen is then something that's utilised by other local authorities within the Alliance. Likewise, we look at smart cities as one of our core pieces of work around data analytics. And within that, there are some specific strands related to water management, for example, which Glasgow are leading on, or looking at mobility as a service and what that looks like in terms of transportation decarbonisation, and Dundee is taking a lead on that. So we do try to absolutely play to our strengths, to learn from each other. And we were having this conversation before we started the session, where we were talking about some of the failures. And the way in which we've approached that is very much on that learning exercise. So there's so much value in a city or a couple of cities taking forward an approach that might be innovative, it might be challenging, and it might fail. But then we can learn from that. We can address some of the fundamental underlying issues and improve the situation for the next cities that will be part of phase 2, phase 3 of the development. So we very much use that vehicle as a learning exercise to innovate, to challenge, and to lobby, essentially, because it's a really powerful vehicle, in a Scottish context, certainly. 8 cities representing, as I say, 3/4 of the population, 3/4 of the economy, to go to UK, to go to Scottish Government, to demand action, not simply to meagerly ask for the tools in which to take it forward, but to demand the tools that we require to make the biggest impact within our own local authority area.
Thank you. And makes me think, when we're thinking about all the cities in the UK and all the local authorities, that we really need some of those pioneers to be sharing the lessons backwards, because there are some local authorities who just don't know where to start. They're right at the beginning of the journey. So sharing those failures. And I think even yesterday when we were talking, so you and Tom were sharing the lessons and things. So coming on to Tom and building on this partnerships sort of agenda. And I think what you in Greater Manchester, you've had some successes in the resilient side with some of the bringing in different organisations to move forward. So tell us more about that.
One of our recent successes is agreeing the integrated water management plan, and that is a collaboration between United Utilities, and delighted to see Gordon, the United Utilities here today, the Environment Agency and the Combined Authority as well. That was signed off this year. We have got some budgets together to resource the initial 6 months programme there. And it really is looking at how we manage the water, the rainwater excesses, how we manage the situations with drought as well, how we look at future growth and development zones, and how we ensure that our water systems are woven into what we do as a future combined authority. So it's the first, certainly in England, in terms of collaboration. I think we're very proud of that in Greater Manchester. And one of the benefits of seeing the growth in city regions over the last decade is that it does allow people, other areas, to learn from one another. So the learns that we've had so far, we're now advising Liverpool City region as they start their journey on the integrated water management plan. But it's an exciting prospect for us. And as Lord Deben was saying at the start, rain isn't what it used to be. And clearly, Manchester is famous for its rain and damp conditions, but even we are experiencing that contrast between very heavy downpours and very hot summers like we had particularly last year. So to be able to come together with the Environment Agency and United Utilities to tackle it and look to the future has been incredibly encouraging.
And did you, in this sort of convening role for cities, bringing together the various actors who were essential to creating that integrated across, a broader region management plan, did you have to exercise that sort of, listen, guys, you need to compromise because what good looks like for you isn't the same? How did that play out?
There is certainly a degree of civic leadership required in that, in bringing people to the table. We had a couple of roundtables as part of the planning process. And we got to a stage where various partners from across Greater Manchester came together to form this plan, and now we know what we need to do for the future. But it is crucial to have that civic leadership there. And we're very fortunate to have quite a well-known and popular mayor within Greater Manchester who's got that power to bring people to the table and look at long-term goals for us all.
Thank you. And in a minute, I'm going to tackle the elephant in the room, being the who's going to pay. But first, to Sarah on the data piece and the data insights, because I suppose what you're shedding light on is this systems piece and where the virtuous cycles exist and the unintended consequence. So tell us more about Credo and where you've seen some of the fascinating insights coming out of that programme.
Yeah, thank you. So Credo is a climate resilience demonstrator, and it shares data across Anglian Water, across UK Power Networks and BT, to look at the connections between the different networks and to see the interdependencies. And what we do in Credo, the digital twin, is we look at the impact of extreme weather events across the whole system, so that we can see if there was a really bad storm in the future and there was flooding, we would see how the flooding would impact certain assets. And if those assets fail because they're wet, we're able to then see how that failure propagates across the whole system, so that we can see as a result of a storm what the cascade of failure is across the whole system. And that helps infrastructure operators plan in advance, so that we'd be able to identify which are the most critical assets across the system, to be able to invest in them, perhaps to relocate to other areas, or to put extra defences around them, so that we'll be less likely to fail under certain weather conditions. And I think one of the things that's interesting, that many things that are interesting have come out of Credo so far, but we hear points being made, such as from the water sector point of view, they see that as a result of using a tool like Credo, they see that it might be better for them to invest in power network resilience rather than their own water network assets, because that will give them a higher level of resilience, because they are so dependent on power network assets. And I think that helps us think about this idea of system resilience. So when we're trying to make the case to invest in an initiative, a project like Credo, there are a couple of issues that come up when we're looking at the benefits. So, for example, the issue with Credo is that benefits accrue to many different parties. So when we're sort of getting that data together to make the benefits case, we can put together that case. But when we see that the benefits accrue to different consumers, to different asset owners, there's the question of who should lead Credo, who should convene Credo, and who should pay for it. And that's a difficult question that we've been dealing with over the years. And so far it's been funded by Innovate UK. But I think we're running those discussions at the moment to see how Credo can be taken forward in the future, and how it should be paid for. And I think it's ultimately, it will be a mix of, say, government and industry needing to pay for it and to take it forward. When you're building that benefits case, the other angle that it's important to look at is the question of, with Credo, it's all about resilience. And so when you're trying to understand the benefits of resilience, the problem that we face is that it's difficult to value resilience. We have poor metrics, and we have a poor understanding of what the value of resilience is. So if we're thinking about Credo, when we look at the benefits of Credo, we look at avoided cost. So how we're able to reduce costs to asset owners in terms of protecting their networks, and how it would reduce repair costs in the future when assets fail and we lose service, and all the things that happen. Those are the sorts of things we build into the benefits case. But really, when we're thinking about resilience, there are all sorts of other unintended consequences that happen as well. And I think we have this very poor understanding of what all the consequences are, what all the other external effects are. When there is a power cut that's being caused by a storm, what are all the things that didn't happen? You weren't able to make the interview, the kids didn't do their homework, or whatever it is, all those knock-on effects that happen because we lost power or communications or running water, or we couldn't get to where we needed to. And I think we need to develop a better understanding of how we value resilience, And I would hope that the Treasury will lead the way in setting out such a study and setting out that guidance, because then we can start to build real numbers into our projects so that we really can make the benefits case for investing in testing out these kind of solutions.
Somebody said to me recently, as well as a department for cost, aka Treasury, we need a department for benefits, which was an interesting way of looking at it. And it strikes me what you're saying to make this work, to surface the information that will share with us where the right place to put that effort is. We need inspirational leaders, and we need people to share the data. So there's a plea to the room here: share your data, because that's what is underpinning the ability to surface some of these things that are otherwise hidden. And then the leaders to really bring together people on their own patch to look at the interconnectivity across the systems. So last but not least, I want to tackle the question of who's going to pay. And that's why it's so fantastic to have Mark from E.ON on the panel, because this is where the rubber's hitting the road. And I guess all my question is teeing up for you to say what you've been doing with a sort of a pioneering solution in Coventry.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you. Let me put a little bit of context to it. So we are really, really proud to have just entered a 15-year strategic partnership with the Council of Coventry. Doubly proud because that's our home city. The way that partnership's going to work is fundamentally different, I think, from anything we've seen before. So the first point is it's 15 years. That gives the partnership the length of time to start to tackle some really, really difficult and really, really big topics. E.ON enters into that partnership having gone through a very strong procurement process, but now with the right to deliver projects with the council. So we have quite a different governance process than perhaps people have seen before. As we go through it, we will jointly identify the right projects. We will jointly bring those through the gate processes to build the business cases, and then we have flexibility over the method for delivering them. That means that we can start to access different value pools and different ways of working. And to give you an idea of how fluid it is, I'm going to give Luke his second shout out of the day, because we actually spent yesterday in a workshop together with our respective organisations, trying to find the common ground, building the strategy together. And we ended up much more aligned than we would have expected at that point, how early we are in the partnership. Now, why is that important? Why does that relate back? Because it's not the lack of available funding. There is money out there. But if you look at how we may have worked with councils in the past, I would say it was project or transactional at best. Typically, dare I say, some of that may have been a bit opportunistic as well. A funding opportunity existed to put some EV charging into a car park. That formed a tender. People tendered around that. They took the limited information that was in the tender. They gave a price and a project was delivered. That's not what we're trying to do here. What we're trying to do is to jointly work up on the things that matter. And in doing that, we're trying to share risks and share opportunities. So, I'm sure Coventry wouldn't mind me saying that they come under huge amounts of financial pressure. That means it's quite hard for them to create money, to create development spend. How do they build the case in the first place? And unless there's a dependency on some of the funding that might be available. E.ON has access to that funding. E.ON has access to that style of resource. So together we can start to work in a very different way because the council knows its city, the council knows its teams. Because we've got the longevity of the relationship, you can start to do things a little bit differently as well. Because we're not trying to create a separate strategy. We're not trying to create a low carbon thing. We're trying to create a strategy that delivers the aspirations of the city. And that means it's a lot easier to access things and not get deprioritized as we go forward. Because we can create jobs. We can create a better place for people to live. And in doing so, actually energy might be the catalyst for doing that. I think a lot of people have mentioned supply chain as well as we've gone through this. By creating the focus and dedication, you can start to create the mechanisms for delivering local supply chain, which makes it better, cheaper, and changes the business case. So E.ON can access the funding. We've got ways that we can raise third-party financing. We can do all of those things. That's not the challenge that we're describing here. It's about creating a new way of working that can identify the right projects with the right transparency to then bring those forward. And the mechanism is flexible, be that the council investing in it, be that E.ON investing in it, be the council helping us with land or access or planning rights, so that jointly we can create something that adds more value for the city. Commercial returns for E.ON, let's be honest about that, but also a wider social benefit at the same time. And that's really, really important to making sure that the relationship has longevity.
And you're, so E.ON has a base in Coventry, so you're invested in Coventry. And that's one of the things that came out of the report that I mentioned, is that there's some sort of long-term joint investment in the resilience of the place that you're a business in. And it's that sort of in-training of success by everyone buying into that common direction that feels really powerful when we say it, and it's exciting that it's now playing out in not just your strategic partnership with Coventry, but Bristol City Leap is another example of that. Yeah, and then just to do a shout out to 3CI, because it is a shame that they aren't able to be represented here. So 3CI stands for the Cities Climate Investment Commission, and it's been was set up several years ago, and it's now it's a collaboration between the core cities in the UK, the Scottish Cities Alliance, the London councils, and it's convened by the Connected Places Catapult, and it's developing proof of concept of a business model, and I see it as I always think of it in terms of three themes that it's doing on that business model. It's pooling, it's pooling, it's bundling, and it's blending. As in order to crowd in the green finance, it's going large, because that's the pooling aspect of multiple cities, creating the pipelines of investment that are of interest to our institutional investors. It's bundling, as in it's taking the attractive investment propositions such as renewables and bundling them together with the less interesting ones like energy efficiency, and creating a bundle that therefore achieves something that is just about investable. And then the final thing, though, on that investability angle is the blending of public and private finance, so that the public finance is used to sort of close the gap, the headroom that is needed by the investors to bring forward. So it's sort of stretching the private investment to help make these pipelines, these massive pipelines, something like over 200 billion pounds worth of low carbon investments just in the 11 biggest cities, I think, in the UK. Is there anything, so I know John, Scottish Cities Alliance are part of that. Anything more on that it's worth saying?
I think you've probably summarised it better than I ever could, to be honest. But it is, these networks are really important for that shared kind of learning. But more importantly, it's also a vehicle for pushing that agenda even harder, because it's been said several times today, local authorities in our cities know exactly what the issues are. They have that contextualised understanding of where our biggest gains could be, as well as where the biggest challenges are, and they also are a vehicle for delivering some of that change. So the partnerships that Mark mentions are really important examples of how the private and public sector come together. And again, through the work of 3CI, Glasgow represents the Alliance in those conversations. We're able to contribute as well as pull out from the discussions that are undertaken. So I think it's another important vehicle. If you'll indulge me, can I come back on your question about funding? Because I think, it often comes back to money. I suppose in simplistic terms, the answer is everybody. So we will all pay for it. So we will all pay for it as individual taxpayers. We will all pay for it in terms of public services, private organisations. But the flip side of that, going back to Lord Deben's point, is that the counter is that we all significantly pay much more if we don't deal with it. And so there is a real need to look at the current funding models and the current way in which we operate to deliver investment in these areas. There's some innovative models that I think we need to look at in greater detail in order to understand how they can be replicated more broadly. E.ON has a connection to the city that you're taking forward that relationship, but we aren't all blessed with an E.ON. So how do the rest of the cities, we'll speak after, how do we develop, how do we develop those relationships? I think it's really important for us. But there's also a reality check required when we talk about funding models. So, the Treasury Green Book test needs to be ripped up and thrown in the bin, quite frankly. It is a barrier to development, it's a barrier to investment, and it's a barrier to progress. Now, we all understand that checks and balances need to be in place, particularly when we're talking about the public purse and, you know, every pound is a prisoner, as we frequently hear in the news. But the old ways of measuring investment and justifying investment do not address the fundamental challenges that are facing us on the climate agenda. So there is something about being really robust and honest and reflecting on that the current financial arrangements, which certainly from a public sector I rely upon, are flawed. They're not fit for purpose. And unless that changes, we won't be able to unlock some of the potential opportunities that exist. Because as Mark says, there is a vast amount of investment opportunity out there. I know frequently, and I've had other meetings while I've been down here, there's a real appetite to invest, but it does require sometimes that public finance to help de-risk and I suppose get the ball rolling on some of those potential projects that come forward. So it's only by unlocking both the public and the private sector funding model that we can really start to make the sea change that's required. And the last thing I'd say is we also need to think about prioritisation. We cannot do everything, and we need to be really honest about that. So, you know, politicians, and I'm going to emphasise the K in this very carefully. I was speaking to businesses in Dundee very recently, and I gave them a commitment not to be an asshole. An asshole is somebody that continues to seek your input, seek your advice, but then ignores it and does whatever they want in the first place. Politicians are very good at being assholes, and we need to stop that, and we need to start listening and also starting to change the approach that we take, because if we don't, then we're not going to make the progress that's required.
Thank you. And that is a perfect segue into a slightly off-script question I wanted to ask to Tom, because thinking about the powers part, the empowerment part of our 4 Ps, and it struck me when Maria was speaking, there's an element of tuning the market, the levers. And I was wondering about the devolution deals and whether there's an angle in there that you can use to sort of create the desire to work together like this.
Yeah, there certainly is. From the Greater Manchester perspective, we've just signed up to the Trailblazer deal. So what will happen there is that we will have a funding formula. It's similar to how funding arrangements work in Scotland and in Wales. So it's quite a big thing. With that single settlement, it means that we can use money how we wish to do so, and that would include looking at our obligations towards the climate agenda. Clearly, with Green City being one of the portfolios that we have, we do take it very seriously there, and I think there's a real opportunity for us to build on the good partnership that we have in place already, not just between the 10 local authorities, but also with the private sector, and better communicate the need to resource infrastructure, to resource development opportunities, so that we are into a much more sustainable footing than we have been in previous years. So there's a lot of opportunity there with devolution. It's very much the local politician connected to the area they represent, so they know what works for the area better than, dare I say, Whitehall may think it knows. So it's a game changer for us what's happening in GM. I'm really, really optimistic about the work that we've done so far, the work that we've signed up to. And I know that the partnership is key for us going forward. So private sector, public sector, all areas of public sector. So it could include the NHS, the key footprint on our local area as well. There's a lot there that we can work with, and devolution allows us to do that.
Great, and I'm loving this because my questions are sort of following on from each other. So next one is for Sarah and Mark, and it's a very simple one. Representing business, what one ask would you each have of the councillors on the panel that would help them to drive the agenda towards both decarbonisation and climate resilience? So I don't know who wants to go first.
I'll have to start. So I think actually both of you just made some really excellent points, because it is the partnership that creates it. It's not just access to the funding. It's understanding the city. It's helping with the local planning. It's actually helping with understanding the local residents and how we reach them. So the partnership can unlock an awful lot more. So my ask would be for longevity in the partnership, because everything becomes a little bit easier. The bundling of things, the sharing of things, the learning that comes with it, if you've got some longevity to the partnership. The minute it becomes transactional, the extra costs of data or analytics become harder because you have to surface them in a different way. When you've got longer term relationships, you learn each other, you can create infrastructure, you can create delivery mechanisms around that. So I guess my really big ask would be to form bigger, deeper partnerships, because that allows the types of bundling that we've described, that allows the smearing of the costs across things, that allows the de-risking, because some of the portfolio projects might not go so well, but over the portfolio, the investment starts to stack up. If you get into the transactional world with businesses like ours, then it becomes a simple question of price, you know, and that delivers a certain thing, but it doesn't necessarily deliver you the quality, the connectivity, or, you know, indeed the pace. So finding new ways of being brave, I think, would be
and I guess
my
picking up on John's point, allow them to fail. You know, allow failure to be a positive, not just always a negative, which is fairly typical of our industry.
But it becomes the wrapper of how you treat that.
Yeah, yes.
Because if it's an individual project and it fails, it's an individual failure. Yes, you might share the learnings with somebody else, but how do you replicate that? Because you've tended for an individual thing. Yeah. So it's the connectivity and the learning over time that allows people to view that investment case differently, those learnings differently, and smearing of the cost differently. And I think that's really the experience of us.
Sarah.
So I think it's about how we go from looking at lots of individual actions and what people can do at a personal level to the big picture and how it all fits together. And for me, part of the solution there is data and how we use it. So it's about working with people so that they can access their own information, use their own information in the right way, understand their energy usage, understand their carbon impact. People don't understand their carbon impact or how what they're doing fits in with what everyone else is doing in the area that they live in. So I think it's giving people access to that information and enabling that information to be shared in a safe way. So people aren't put at risk when they share their personal information, but at least they understand what the impact of their own interventions, their own actions are. To that sort of big picture view is, across a city, how do all these different interventions add up? How do we prioritize those different interventions? And you really need data to understand that. So that's really sort of sharing data at the sort of the bigger picture level across organizations. And I think it's working with organizations to help break down those barriers to sharing data. I don't think it's not all about making all data open. That is not the answer. Some personal data and some system data needs to be protected. It needs to be kept secure, but it's about working with organizations to enable them to share data in the right way so that we can really start to see how do all these different actions and interventions add up to something. Because I feel at the moment, it's piecemeal. We're really looking, there are good initiatives all over the place, but we don't really have a sense of how it all adds up. And I think that's what people really want to see. They want to understand, what difference can I make? And how does that fit in the big picture of the place that I live in?
Thank you. So the final, we've got about 5 minutes left. The final angle of those that 4-pillar set of recommendations was the people angle, and I'm just wondering how to frame that last bit of the conversation. But just as an example of where you have seen successes across any of you of bringing the people into the conversation and enabling them to act as that powerful sort of leader of action by bringing them together in a body to see change. Because I guess we've seen the slightly negative impacts of it sometimes with things like the ultra low emission zone and the 15-minute cities. But where are the positives on that? Any examples?
Can I maybe just start us off? Picking up on the data point, I think that's a really important point, because we can only monitor how we're improving if we know where we started, I suppose, and where we've been. So it's really important. So there's been a huge piece of work across the 8 cities in Scotland. We call it our 8th city programme, but that was before Dunfermline officially became a city last year. So we'll have to call it our 9th city programme. And that was about data across a whole suite of particular areas. but it was also about open data. So making sure that we've got that anonymised data that we can really provide analysis and information for private sector, public sector, and individual level. But making that real to people is really fundamental. So we've done a small scale project, I suppose, in the grand scheme of things in Dundee, which we're calling Hello Lamppost. So essentially, we're using Climate West software, which breaks down the city of Dundee into its component parts in terms of our climate change journey. That has meant that we've had some success globally in terms of being identified alongside Edinburgh as one of 122 global leaders in terms of our transparency and global data on the climate journey. But what we've done is throughout every single community in Dundee, we have essentially stickers. It's not rocket science. Stickers, QR codes, which allow people to access the data. So we have these on benches, we have these on sort of BT hubs, lampposts, as the name suggests, where people will come upon these stickers, QR codes, and will be able to access in real-time data on our impact on the environment in a really manageable way. Alongside that, what we've also tried to do is empower communities. So we do that through a number of different ways. One way in which I always find you get public buy-in is if you give them money. So what we did was we created our climate change fund, which devolved, again, not a huge amount of money in the grand scheme of things, but £750 million, in which we said to the public, identify the projects which you think will manifestly make a positive impact in your community, and the justification for that, and then we put it to a public vote. And those projects were then successful in obtaining funding. So through providing information in an accessible manner, by providing resources and empowering the community to make some of those decisions, which are not always easy decisions, that's one mechanism we have for kind of changing some of the conversation. But it's much more difficult than that, of course, and that's only a small example of some of the ways I think the cities can assist in helping the journey of individuals, communities, and the broader city to make progress against that.
Thank you. And I see it's something about being able to show that there may be some short-term pain, but there is long-term gain, and using data to be able to craft these really powerful scenarios that show the future could look like this, or it could look like this. Which one do you prefer, and get the buy-in that way to this short-term pain that might be the case. Any other thoughts there?
Yeah,
yes.
I mean, just going back to Sarah's point, it's clear that we need to do a lot more to tell a story, and politicians have a real role in telling that story as to what individual actions people take, how it impacts, and there's a positive impact on the wider area. In terms of a couple of positives, though, that we've done in Greater Manchester, we've had our retrofit programme where we have focused in on fuel-poor households. And we've targeted retrofitting for around 3,000 households across Greater Manchester. Clearly, the link there is not just the green link, but the impact, that's positive impact that's had on people being able to heat their homes, particularly, as we look at the increasing energy bills and the pressure that puts on households. So that is something that I'm very proud of what we've done in Greater Manchester. Another thing that we've been looking at is clearly progressing active travel, which is, as people remarked, is quite a contentious one. But if you look at the amount of investment that's gone into, say, London in the last 20 years, and I mean, we walked from hotel to here today, the number of cyclists that there are in London, and people that are living in London may take that for granted, as you should do. But if we can get there with our £40 million programme in Greater Manchester, that we see people shifting to more active travel, there's a huge positive story to tell, not just in terms of physical health and well-being, but also the impact, the positive impact that will have on the carbon footprint as well. So there are a couple of examples of stuff that we can do, that we just need to tell that story as to how that benefits the individual, and we're getting there with that, I think.
I'm going to finish there and do a bit of a wrap up, because I really like how you finish that tell that story. And so hopefully what the panel has done is given you a bit of an insight into what things look like from a city's perspective, and then how business can play its part in helping the cities achieve that direction where we'll all win. And the citizens and play their part. Because in Mott MacDonald, we have a way of thinking about things, which is think about your client's client. And for most of the infrastructure sector, the client's client is the citizen, and we're doing this for them ultimately. So I think that's a great place to end. And thank you, everybody. But most importantly, thank you to our panel.
Thank you.
Oh, I forgot to say refreshments now. I knew there was something I was going to forget, but back out through the doors. You've earned it.
Like really.
We're going to need to restart shortly, so if everyone can return to your seats, please. Thank you, everyone. I hope you all had a lovely break and had some good conversation. So fantastic first session this morning. I'm just going to welcome our next few speakers. So the next session is very much focused on embedding decarbonisation in major infrastructure projects. I lead decarbonisation as a discipline at Mott MacDonald. Previous attendees to Carbon Crunch may recognise me. I've been involved in it the last few years. It's been absolutely fantastic to turn up today and have the whole thing organised. Just get to come and say a few words, but thank you again for attending. First session, and particularly that conversation around cities and how interconnected everything is, really does link into the next speaker. Now, decarbonising major infrastructure projects is really difficult. That's the reason we're here for our 11th Carbon Crunch. We didn't solve this at the beginning. It is all very interconnected. As Maria explained brilliantly in terms of Past 2080, how it works with different members of the value chain, the systems nature of it, does make it challenging. But of course, right sitting at the top of that is the clients and the leadership that they show. So we're going to hear about part of that from Matt Prescott at Heathrow. It's a project that I also know very well, having worked on it many years ago. It's, you know, when we think about aviation, we obviously think about the emissions from the air transport themselves, but airports are far more complex than that. We've got to think about the capital build, all of the kind of, you know, an airport is really like a city in miniature with all the different systems that connect together, the energy demands there, the surface access, how people travel to it. So yeah, really, really interesting from a decarbonisation perspective. I'm not going to say any more on it than that. I'll hand you over to Matt, who is Head of Carbon Strategy at Heathrow Airport.
Thanks, Mark. And good to see everybody today. So, and sorry I missed this session earlier, which I'm told I can catch up on the live stream. So I look forward to doing that. So what I thought I'd cover is just 3 points that I think are really important to what we're doing at Heathrow. So the first one is plan it right. The second is cover it all. And the third is align everybody. So if I just move on to the first of those points, this is a selection of the targets from our net zero plan called Heathrow 2.0. And you'll probably, for those of you familiar with airports, you'll probably notice that a lot of airports have set quite distinct targets. So there's quite a lot of talk about getting to net zero around about the 2030 mark. Is something that's probably pretty familiar, well, it is pretty familiar across different sectors. And as you can see here, we decided to separate our scope from what we call the in the air scope and on the ground scope. And we're aiming for up to around 15% carbon reduction by 2030 for emissions in the air. That's against the 2019 peak year baseline, and 45% on the ground. And that looks less ambitious than some of the plans that you see. But I'm mindful here in target setting about the challenges aviation in particular has around the claims it makes, because there's, one only needs to hit, green claims aviation into Google to see the volume of material criticizing the sector for talking about high ambition and missing it. And so there's something really important, first of all, about planning right. These targets were driven by taking the CCC's 6 carbon budget, applying them to the Heathrow context, and then really largely top down, asking the business to stretch to see can it achieve some of those significant decarbonisation objectives within there. Of course, taking some of that bottom up, engineering and others are saying they can do and do have in plan. So that sort of tension between top down, bottom up gave us these figures. But with green, the Green Claims Directive being a good example coming through 2026 in the EU, the consequences of this kind of push for clarity about what can be achieved needs to be a really careful balancing act between stretch targets, the art of the possible, trying to go further, but then also not tripping over the fact that our stakeholders will criticise us heavily if we miss. So that's the Planet Right piece. I've got a couple of slides here just drawn from our net zero plan. This basically covers the in the air, and you can see the point here, and why I said cover it all, is that we've scoped in all emissions, including departing flights to destination. And that's really rather important. And when you do that, 95% of our carbon footprint is from flights. So that's indirect scope 3. But then if you look at on the ground, and these are in sequence of magnitude in our carbon footprint, supply chain, goal 6 there, together with surface access, goal 5, you add those to the in the air emissions, this is 99% of our carbon footprint. And so it becomes really important to focus on indirect scope 3 emissions, which we all know, and that's very difficult. Just to sort of bring that to life, sort of some of the how do we approach it, I think one of the things that probably is quite common across all of us here is thinking about those embodied carbon in infrastructure. We're not alone in doing this, but we got a PhD student to look at low carbon concrete opportunities in airfield pavement, for instance. We've got an airside test environment live now with several different batches that have gone in a few months ago. And the opportunity there is rather huge, because if we're able to, together with others, identify opportunities to reduce the embodied carbon in concrete, if we can then change the standards for Heathrow, which of course, when we're going up to airfield pavement are pretty stringent, but if we can find ways through different mixes and through other circular economy principles to reduce some of that embodied carbon, the opportunity not only in Heathrow's own development projects, but in airfield projects globally is then to cut some of those carbon emissions. So thinking about it purely as a sort of Heathrow context, that's a great opportunity. It could be a really good news story if we could start talking about reducing that embodied carbon, so significant a contribution it makes. But actually from a systems point of view, there could be a carbon reduction opportunity that exceeds, frankly, all of the flight emissions from Heathrow on a global basis. So sort of really embracing that opportunity to embed the right standards and really drive that energy through the supply chain is a fabulous opportunity. And then the other thing I'd say about this is, as a client, we need to be intelligent. It goes without saying, but actually in that example, this is about a collective intelligent client. This is a sort of infrastructure intelligent client across the economy, not just single actors. There's good practice sharing. There's all sorts of forums to come together. But setting standards collectively could really drive pace in a way that we wouldn't otherwise see. So that's an exciting arena. I've also been, I mean, again, this is sort of nothing new if you look at the kind of global concepts around embedding greater resilience and adaptation into airports. But I've been playing with the concept of what I've been calling Heathrow Garden Airport, which is essentially, it's not a big bang thing where we suddenly drape every building in an urban green infrastructure. But the case for adaptation is so strong purely from an economic case, let alone passenger experience, colleague well-being, and the other benefits. But again, that can be driven through standards. We don't need to, it shouldn't be a big bang moment where all of a sudden there's vertical farming on the compass center. But actually, if we're writing into the specifications that we want to see this infrastructure incorporated, and we promote that in the right way, then some of those changes start to work through the system organically, and we can take advantage of all of the different skills and ideas sitting across all of our suppliers in order to deliver the best outcome. And that kind of thing is really exciting. So then my final one was align everybody. I mean, this is a slightly random schematic of how different stakeholders are connected and some of the things we're doing. But I think it's really important to make sure that everyone is aligned to that shared vision, because fundamentally what we need is freedom within a framework to be innovative, move forward with projects, understand and overcome the risk issues that we have, in particular at Heathrow, very risk-averse airside environment, but within a agreed framework and a shared vision, it's possible to accelerate some of the innovation that we want to see, and actually we're committed to through Heathrow 2.0. So with my remaining under a minute, what I thought I just want to draw attention to one thing, because it would be remiss of me not to pull this one out, but to the bottom right there, talking about sort of all working together. The biggest part of our carbon footprint is jet fuel. The biggest thing we can be doing right now is helping to scale the market in sustainable aviation fuel, particularly putting pressure on UK legislators to really accelerate some of those jet zero commitments to getting plant built domestically. And one of the things we're doing on behalf of the King's Terra Carta initiative is a program called 30 by 30, where we're looking to get corporate organisations to commit to using 30% sustainable aviation fuel by 2030, something that we'll be promoting at COP. So anyone interested in that, that's the kind of collaboration that we can all join together with to make a difference today. So thank you. Mark, back to you.
Thank you, Matt. That's fantastic. We're not doing Q&A right now, but we are going to have a table discussion following the next speaker, where I'm sure we can go through some of those themes that you introduced. So thank you for that, Matt. That was brilliant. So our next speaker is Andrew Kidd, who's Director of Environment Strategy on the Lower Thames Crossing. And I know your story is about kind of setting up for success and very much about that leadership position that you can show as a client and setting the strategy. Over to you, Andrew.
So Lord Deben gave us a few challenges in terms of client leadership and in terms of his point of view on roads. I'll see how you think we're doing. Lower Thames Crossing, what's the point of it? Well, it's a new connection between Kent and Essex, which at the moment are two economies completely segregated by the River Thames. Okay, so this new crossing opens up opportunity right across the Thames Estuary region. It also takes pressure off an existing crossing at Dartford, which is the only crossing anywhere east of Greenwich, all the way out to the sea. And lastly, it opens up a free-flowing route for the trade coming in through our channel ports up into the Midlands and across the rest of the country. So it's kind of a conventional business case for building a road. Right? But we've got a problem, because building a road in the context of a climate emergency is not hugely popular. What do we do with that problem? Well, the answer for us, at least, was take it head on. So our challenge really is, how do you deliver this infrastructure, deliver all this economic benefit, and do the right things in terms of net zero? Actually, can we use this project to really accelerate the progress of the construction sector towards net zero? And why do I say the construction sector? Because most people think about, folks driving up and down on this new road. But we won't open it until the early 2030s. And if you actually think that decarbonisation of road travel to about a 2050 trajectory is credible, and I personally think it is, we basically know what the technologies are that get us there, and they are being rolled out today, then actually you end up with most of our carbon footprint is construction. It's to do with building it, not the lifetime of people driving up and down it. And our footprint's just the same as pretty much any other infrastructure project. It's all about steel, cement and concrete, and it's diesel. So what have we done? Well, we started where everyone sort of tells you to start, and we did what we thought were the right things in terms of good carbon management practice. We got ourselves PAS 2080 accredited, which Maria will be pleased to hear. We built a pretty detailed carbon model of the scheme to understand where our footprint is. And we then took 30% out of it, and we said, okay, we'll set that as a limit, and we'll make a legal commitment to that, which we've done through our development consent order. So through our planning, we gave ourselves a planning obligation, essentially, to deliver within a limit. And we set it at 30% because that's what we saw in the market. That's what we believed that others were doing across the sector. We then deliberately procured for low carbon. So we asked the construction industry to come and deliver on a low carbon basis. And it was a significant part of our evaluation for our 3 big design and build contracts. So that's about £4 billion worth of construction contracts we put in the market. We said we want these on a low carbon basis. That went quite well for us, actually. I've got to say, the construction industry did quite well. They came back across the 3. We've announced 2, and we've got 1 to go. But all the winning tenderers essentially have committed to a lower limit for their contract than the one we asked them to commit to. So we're going to come out of that process about 50% better than doing nothing. And that's basically for free. Okay. Now, in case you think we're just going to leave it to the market to solve everything, we've actually invested a lot of effort trying to understand what our future supply chain might look like and what the technologies were that were out there, what was coming shortly, over the kind of period of our program. We wanted to be a super well-informed client so that we knew what to ask for, when to ask for it, and how to ask for it. We did a load of work on what those things might cost. We got that first 50% for free. But after that, you're into the areas where it starts getting increasingly difficult. You're going to be bringing forward new technologies, new approaches. There is some cost to those, at least in the short term. Some will have cost in the long term. If you do carbon capture and storage, it's always going to be more expensive than a chimney. Right? Having done all of that, we then realized actually that was really complicated. Why don't we just make this simple? Why don't we just say what carbon intensity we want for stuff? So we looked at those kind of big 3 challenge areas of concrete, steel, and diesel. We've actually done asphalt as well. And we said, okay, this is what we want. We want a carbon intensity of this for each of these products. We're basically choice editing out the worst performing products. But we are pitching the level for this scheme to really take us into quite a leading position. Broadly speaking, where we are on concrete is what the industry's already told us they can do. Steel is better than what the industry's told us it can offer. We know it's out there in the European market, and we know it will be available in the timeframes that we're talking about, but it costs more, and that's where we can help. Right? And diesel, actually, that's quite punchy, and that's probably the area where we see that we will need to support our value chain the most. And we're not just putting this all on our delivery partners and their supply chain, we recognise that as a client, we've got a role to play throughout. And there are some places where we need to play more than others. And actually diesel is one of them. So we are out to market today. We launched a procurement for quite a lot of hydrogen, 6,000 tonnes of hydrogen. Earlier this year, that process will run through till the middle of next year. But essentially, we are looking to secure a supply of hydrogen, so the availability of the fuel is off the table as a problem. And the construction industry can then come to the party with fuel switching in asphalt and with hydrogen as a fuel for big, heavy, mobile diggers and dumpers on our construction site. So all that work that we did on what's the art of the possible actually has been useful. We're not just relying on some fridge stickers. Okay. Right, so after kind of 3 years, actually, we've done a load of work. We want to maintain a really leading position as a project. It's provided great value to us already. It's quite difficult to make new road projects sexy when there's so much else going on in the infrastructure market, actually. But people do want to come and work on a program that's really pushing the boundaries on carbon. So it's done all sorts of things for us. And we're running a whole, it's quite a complex change program, actually, when you look at what we're trying to do across the project and with the industry. But if we were going to really try and simplify it, we would say, actually, if you just do these 5 things, you'll get a long way there. If you do past 2080, create the framework, know your numbers, and you contract for low carbon, that's both procure and incentivize for low carbon, that sets up designing out carbon in your supply chain. And then you can work on the materials, which is what we're doing through these kind of EPC type stickers, and basically raising the drawbridge in terms of what's acceptable in terms of the carbon intensity of the products used on our scheme. So it can be really complex if you want it to be, or you can just make it as simple as you possibly can. There we go.
Can you hear me? Yeah, hi. Yeah, so all I'm going to say here is basically introduce the next session. That's all I'm going to do, which is we're going to sit down for about 20, 25 minutes in our tables and reflect on some of the stories we heard this morning, both on resilience, decarbonization. And it would be really good if each of us on the table, if you haven't introduced yourself, please do, just to perhaps share the top challenge you have in your organization, and maybe a good solution that you have found for any of those problems that you want to share with others. I mean, it's Chatham House, meaning, yeah, I'm not going to say after the event, Anna said this, Gordon said that. No, it's just, just share good stories if you like, and challenges as well, yeah? So we have 25 minutes and that's it really, yeah, cool, thank you. Yeah.
three strands of decarbonisation, nature and resilience. So with that, if I could invite our first speaker, Jessica van Staden, Senior Sustainability Manager at South Western Railways. Jessica's going to talk to us a little bit about what the commitments and the plans that South Western Railways have to become a nature positive organisation. Thank you, Jessica.
Hello, everyone. So I'm here to talk to you today about South Western Railways' approach to biodiversity, and it's linked to our decarbonisation roadmap and how it supports the performance of our network through strengthened climate resilience. So South Western Railway is one of the larger train operating companies in the UK. The network runs from southwest London through to southwest England, going all the way down to the Isle of Wight, alongside the coast to Weymouth, and then up to Salisbury and Exeter. This is known as the Wessex network, and it spans approximately 1,300 miles wide and with over 200 stations. The network is home to a wide range of animals and plant species, which we hope to protect and help flourish. The map behind me shows a snapshot of South Western Railways network running through a number of protected sites. The Wessex network acts as a wildlife corridor, providing important links for habitats. We recognise the potential of our network to provide unique habitats for local plants, animals, and insects to thrive. So South Western Railway doesn't own the Wessex network. Instead, we lease our stations from Network Rail, who own and maintain the UK's railways. Network Rail is one of the largest landowners in the UK and have ownership of a number of the mitigations required to develop a climate-resilient network. We recognise that champion nature can ease climate disruption, helping us to adapt by providing natural flood protection and temperature regulation. And we have a number of work streams underway to champion nature on the Wessex network. Last year, we launched our Better for Our Future sustainability strategy consisting of 3 pillars: planet, places, and people, with a commitment to becoming biodiversity net positive by 2030 under our planet pillar. To be biodiversity net positive, we will halt and reverse nature's decline on our network and have an overall positive impact on nature. In the next year and a half, we will have produced biodiversity action plans for 50 locations on our network and would have made progress on implementing these. We will create wildlife corridors and community gardens in partnership with Network Rail. And during the last 12 months alone, we've converted the equivalent of 3 football pitches into biodiversity gardens in collaboration with RSPB. South Western Railway has signed the Nature Positive Business Pledge. As part of the pledge, we are mapping the biodiversity on our network. South Western Railway will assess its impact on nature through its business activities using a 2020 baseline year. The impacts will include the effects of greenhouse gas emissions, as well as impacts on nature through South Western Railway's supply chain. We'll be looking at the full life cycle of our train service from conception to delivery. We'll create a nature positive action plan to determine how South Western Railway will become nature positive and contribute to regeneration and restoration of nature. And we will establish what quick wins can be achieved, as well as any longer term challenges to overcome. Last year, South Western Railway launched its decarbonisation strategy. South Western Railway have committed to becoming net zero railway by 2040 and have backed this up with science-based targets. As the UK climate changes, we need to be prepared to adapt, both through reducing the resources we use and making sure our trains can still run effectively on our network. We will work with Network Rail to develop resilience plans so that we are better prepared for extreme weather. We will collaborate with stakeholders to identify risk areas and priorities in the Southwest region. We will also undertake a high-level carbon baseline of habitats within our management by assessing carbon sequestration. This will account for the progress on carbon impacts through habitat management. So the performance of South Western Railway's train service is regularly impacted by severe weather. In severe heat, rail temperatures can reach up to 20 degrees higher than air temperatures. The rail itself can expand with heat, increasing rail buckling, and signalling equipment can overheat and fail. The ground underneath the track can dry out and shrink, causing track to move with it, and this is known as soil moisture deficit. Last year, UK had the driest July since 1935, resulting in highest levels of soil moisture deficit since record keeping began in 2009. In these conditions, it's not safe to run trays at full speed with temporary speed restrictions introduced. In more serious instances of rail buckling, signal failure, and soil moisture deficit, we're not able to run services at all. The autumn season is surprisingly tough for the railway. Wet leaves fall on rails and are crushed to a slippery pulp by running trains. This causes trains to slip when accelerating and braking. This year, there were 10,000 leaf fall risk sites identified on the Wessex route, with dead, dying, or diseased trees a key contributor. This highlights the importance of climate resilience vegetation on our network. Floodwaters can rise above the rail, short-circuiting the conductor rail. Floodwaters also damage trackside points, signalling, and signalling equipment. It can wash away ballast, which supports the sleepers, destabilizing the track. This can lead to large-scale disruption and cancellation of services. In the last financial year, climate-related incidents accounted for 9% of SWR's total delays and 50% of our total cancellations. This photo shows track collapse due to a landslide in Hook caused by heavy rainfall in January earlier this year. So how can biodiversity support climate resilience on the Wessex network? We know that plants and trees absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and biodiversity-rich ecosystems such as forests, grasslands, and wetlands are particularly effective at storing carbon. Vegetation provides valuable flood protection. It slows down runoff and provides increased interception from flood control and storm surges. Vegetation roots provide stabilization for embankments, preventing landslides. And wetlands can absorb 40% of their weight in water, reducing flooding and improving water quality. The Mott MacDonald team have completed an indicative biodiversity mapping of the Wessex network. Key habitats identified are grasslands, woodlands, and fens. These habitats provide valuable ecosystem services, including climate resilience. And through the progression of the nature positive and climate resilience work streams, we hope to improve these habitats to maximize these benefits and improve the biodiversity of our wildlife corridors. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jessica. It's really great. I think Lord Deben mentioned in the very beginning part of the day about the importance of nature, and it's a really great example to hear what South Western Railways have been doing in terms of bringing together action on nature, decarbonisation and resilience, because clearly you've set out beautifully for us there the multiple benefits. Thank you very much, Jess. So that takes us on to our second speaker in this section. And I'm really grateful and pleased to introduce David Boyer, Director of Electricity Systems at the Energy Networks Association. So something else that we've heard quite a lot about already today is about the role of infrastructure sectors facilitating both decarbonisation and resilience. And I think it's fair to say that the energy networks sector has a huge role to play here in both decarbonisation and resilience. And we talked about some of the interdependencies that exist with other sectors. I think everything is underpinned by energy. So thank you very much, David.
Right, good afternoon. So yes, my name is David Boyer. I'm Director of Electricity Systems for the Energy Networks Association. I'll run through a bit of that role that we're playing and some of the focuses we have, both challenges faced and activities we have underway to make sure that energy networks are supporting the achievement of the net zero transition. So just a little bit about the networks and the Energy Association, just to kick things off, but also the role that we play here. We represent all the electricity networks and gas networks in Britain and the UK. So the electricity networks, I confess to a little bit of bias here, obviously I would in my role, but on screen you can see the set of distribution companies we represent across the country and the transmission companies as well, sitting over them on the right. They all play a really essential role, and actually one of the things we're spending a lot of time on now is how making sure that the coordination across those two levels of the system, as well as coordination with gas networks as well, is part of the integrated solution. But key across all of that is the role that we have, which is ensuring that we can deliver electricity and gas to consumers safely, economically, and reliably, but increasingly clearly now in this context is sustainably and in a way that supports those customers and those sectors' decarbonizations, as we've been hearing about. So that is really very much our focus. We touched a bit on the table discussion earlier, but the policy context in which this happens is really, really important to call out. Networks need to facilitate customers' decarbonisation aims and objectives. They need to facilitate the execution of government's policies around decarbonisation. So, we are playing that role of enabling and responding to and supporting those policy objectives. Which isn't straightforward, as you can see on the slide. There is a lot of movement in this space, and a lot of it's really impactful from the point of view of what network infrastructure is needed where, how to invest in it, where to invest it, and how that's achieved. So everything from how the heating sector is decarbonised, which network through which is the heating sector going to be decarbonised, the way in which the energy crisis driven by the war in Ukraine has impacted all this context and driving the cost of living crisis, which clearly is a factor in investment decisions. And then politics can't be avoided in this context. Clearly, some of the announcements we've heard already are election related, and they drive impacts in what infrastructure is needed where and what the decarbonisation actions are. And in all of that context, there's a big chunk of work around the regulation. I think the UK is rightfully can be proud of how regulation has evolved within networks and utilities, regulated utilities generally, but that is continuing and needs to continue to support this. And so, the review of electricity market arrangements, institutional governance, and the creation of the future system operator, all these things, charging reforms are things that are happening and continue to happen at pace in all of this context. So there is a lot on that needs to be followed through. So if we think in that context, what are the challenges that networks have and are focused on in terms of how can infrastructure support the decarbonisation? Clearly, one of the first big things, I imagine many of you will have come across this in one form or the other, is there is a big challenge in efficiently enabling grid connection for customers and for projects, be it storage, generation, low carbon generation, or even just some of the wider decarbonisation sectors in demand. In the 12 months up to the end of last year, transmission applications exceeded 164 gigawatts. So in the 12 months coming into the last year, the new applications that came in through the door for supply in Britain, has a current system peak of less than 50 gigawatts, was 164. It's a huge inflection point. Makes you wonder where the rest of the country is that all these things are going to be cited on. But it's in this context that there is a significant queue and a significant challenge. We need to respond to that. We need to make sure that we can provide access to the grid for real projects, for the right projects, and the projects that customers need. Next thing is around delivery of the infrastructure that those projects need. Those are currently quite significantly frustrated by planning delays and consents and waivers reform that allow infrastructure to be delivered in a timely way. A few fun anecdotes here. It's always easy to bemoan planning, but I can't help myself. If we were to add an additional conductor to an existing overhead line, wooden pole, local bit of infrastructure, if we were to add an additional conductor to support the connection of a storage device or a set of solar panels in a farm, that would trigger the need for 2 to 4 years of planning review to add a conductor to an existing pole span. That context really will significantly frustrate the progress of delivering infrastructure to support net zero. The transmission version of that scary stat is that it takes about 2 years to physically build a transmission line. It takes about 11 to deliver one in Britain because of planning. So all of these things really do need to be addressed to support the timely delivery of infrastructure. And it is important because we do need to invest. We do need to invest in electricity network capacity in particular, but across the piece, we need to be making sure the networks have the right capacity. In any decarbonisation scenario, the electricity networks will be significantly growing in their in what they need to supply for capacity. And in that context, the question around decarbonisation of what is currently in the gas sectors and how the policy frameworks and the regulatory frameworks support that is really important and significantly still in flux. So I'm just going to give a fairly quick run through of some of the things that are happening that both in terms of supporting those challenges, generally for decarbonisation, and also on ensuring resilience in this context. So first thing is networks are investing more than they ever have before in reinforcements and infrastructure. Over 40 billion is approved and will be invested in the current price control specifically. The innovation programs are continuing to be driven by networks to get to the next approaches, the next solutions that will support this in a timely manner. And the flexibility markets that support more efficient transition, a smart and optimized system, are growing year on year. Britain has one of the largest flexibility markets for networks and local services in the world, and that needs to continue to grow, but is pretty leading and a thing we're very proud of. Data and digitalization and continues to be a focus as well, modernizing those approaches. I mentioned connections being a significant challenge. There's a huge focus and a major set of programs, both through distribution, through the Energy Networks Association working groups we've got on that, and also through some of the ESOs, National Grid's transmission level reforms. We are really driving at that. And again, continuing to engage with the policymakers to support the evolution of those frameworks, or the right use of those existing frameworks to meet those challenges, is really important. And then finally, on resilience. So in this context, resilience continues to be important, and increasingly important, for a couple of reasons. One is that the climate change risk posed is not a risk, it's an issue, it's materializing, as you've heard in the rail context. So being able to respond to that and mitigate that impact is critical. And the other reason is that the dependency that we have on electricity is increasing as well. So in the old world, the value of lost load, as was termed, the value of keeping supply on, was set at a certain value, but that is in the context when telecoms generally worked without electricity, transport generally worked without electricity, etc. So the value of lost load, as it were, and the importance of resilience is continuing. So across this, we're continuing to reform our engineering standards to make sure we hit those, we can be more robust, more mitigated to the impacts of climate change. We're already delivering significant expansions of flood prevention and flood investments in the network to make sure it continues to be robust, engaging with customers and communications improvements so we can better support customers in outage scenarios, and also reviewing those security of supply requirements and design standards so that we know that we are appropriately reflecting and designing to and building to the resilience that is needed for what is now an increasingly critical energy source. So that's a very quick run through, and I'm out of time, so I'll stop there.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much, David. Yeah, I think just the point you made at the end there about increasing climate risk, and that we are not going to be able to meet our net zero goals, targets, aspirations if we don't do it in a resilient way. So yeah, thank you for that. Really, really good presentation. Okay, so our third speaker in this section is Gordon Rogers, Head of Long-Term Strategy for United Utilities. And United Utilities, along with all the water companies, has been going through a process of long-term planning, long-term delivery strategy planning. And that's really been about taking an adaptive approach to help answer this question of what needs to be done over the long term, when it needs to be done, and how we schedule that. So Gordon, you're going to talk to us a little bit about how decarbonisation and net zero features in those long-term plans.
Sure will, thank you. Afternoon, everybody. So yeah, I'm going to just to explain for anybody who doesn't know United Utilities, because the clue isn't really in the title like some of the other water companies. We're one of the larger water companies in England, providing water, drainage, wastewater treatment services to the northwest. And so we serve about 7 million domestic customers, 200,000 businesses, stretch from Scottish borders to Cheshire, and quite a big patch. So it's a huge FTSE 100 listed organisation. I'm going to stay laser-like focused on net zero just for a few minutes on this. And as we were saying, just share some of our really latest work that we just put into our business plan that we published last Monday. I will touch on some resilience and nature bits within that, but I guess I'm going to be unselfishly focused on net zero. And to me, net zero and achieving net zero as a collective society, not just as an organisation, is the first rung of our route to resilience. I always think, and it's interesting how many cross points there are with all the other infrastructure sectors, but we are all on the front foot really of feeling climate change, responding to it already as infrastructure operators and managers, and certainly as a water operator. We feel that first and foremost, both whether there's the dry summers we've been experiencing, and we are in kind of more and more active measures to maintain water supplies through those periods, and equally in all these extreme rainfall events, and the drainage system being kind of the lowest point of gravity and having a huge role. alongside others in managing drainage and flood management. So we're kind of on the front foot, as are many infrastructure operators. And therefore, net zero to me, if we don't achieve that, I struggle to see in the projections that we have for the second half of this century how we are going to maintain both, keyword both, affordable and resilient water and wastewater services. We are resilient today, made massive progress over the last over recent decades. In our resilience, we will find a route to resilience that is I think, not in question. How affordable it is, I think we can see incremental levels of change, the worse the climate change is in the long term. So with that in mind, we've put an awful lot of effort, our most granular plans, detailed analysis, supported by Mott's actually, and Jacob, so thank you to those teams, in building our plans through particularly to 2030, but very much in that long-term context through to net zero in scope 1, 2 and 3 by 2050 as our priority. So just to give you a little bit of context, we are a science-based targets company like many in the room. We were proudly the first in the water sector to get science-based targets for scope 1, 2 and 3 with the SBTI. So you can see our figures that we're working through to 2030, some quite bold ambitions within that for both some dramatic reductions in scope 1 and 2, and equally escalating that scope 3 side of things much more and recognising that collaboration in the supply chain, as we've been touching on so much. And I'll come on to a lot more in that because that's a real challenge for us as a sector. So within that, on the left there, we have these 6 pledges that we made in 2020. And the top and tail at 1 and 6 really set out that route to underpin everything in the science-based approach. And it's not all about 2050 and getting to net zero at that point. We all know in this room, it's the pathway to that matters. And so we're desperately trying to find a route to 42% reduction in scope 1 and 2. And 25% reduction despite massive upward pressures, which I'll come on to in a second. And then the 4 middle ones are kind of some of the most pressing priorities where we know we can act both cost effectively and technically feasibly. And that isn't always a straightforward thing at scale. So the 2 ticks show some of the ones we've achieved, greening our electricity. So we've done a lot of the cheaper elements already. We're quite advanced relative to many. And that decarbonises to some level at least an awful lot of our operational emissions. But there are so many more other things to come to. We're now focused, particularly a bit of a war on fossil fuels, as I'll come on to, but greening our fleet in quite ambitious timescales. We can see various routes to that, but heavy goods elements still a challenge. And then we're a big landowner in the northwest. And again, linking to nature and that whole systems thinking of our source catchments and so on. Big efforts on peatland and woodland. So quite bold progress already. And equally quite bold challenges. And so this kind of, that lump there is what keeps me awake at night, frankly. So this, in our annual report back in July, we put our head above the parapet and continuing to be quite leading in our disclosures. We had to go at our first transition plan as part of our TCFD. We mapped out, we've updated all that as part of our latest price review assessment, so there is some real numbers behind this graph, albeit it is partly illustrative at the same time. But you can see some of the progress we've been making in reducing our emissions by particularly focusing on electricity, but particularly in scope 3, this dark blue bit, and with all the political agenda and the new Environment Act for the water sector, and being the wettest region in the northwest of England, we're 28% wet, so we have more CSOs, storm overflows. We have a huge capital investment programme coming up in AMP8 and probably even more in AMP9. We haven't built that in yet because we didn't want to flag uncertainty, back to Lord Deben's point, but almost certainly a business as usual route will be an even bigger peak. So we have this huge challenge to outperform massive growth pressures, particularly in scope 3. So all those in the supply chain, I'm really keen to talk to you. We're trying to do a lot of what we've been hearing from other partners and bake this in. But equally, these bits at the bottom not to be ignored. How do we lock in the electricity improvements and go further on clean energy? We've got lots of opportunity to do that. And how do we unpick some really stubborn bits in our process emissions, which are really quite systemic and integrated into our infrastructure. So the exciting bit, I think, Ofwat, thank you, James, wherever James is in the room, has the most significant measures and incentives in our price review submission through for 2025 to 2030. So that they have really moved forward themselves. We've tried to entirely embrace and embed that. The instruction to us at the price review from DEFRA, the Environment Agency, and Ofwat as our kind of main regulators was to take net zero seriously and effectively comply with the national Climate Change Act. So we've done exactly that, and we need to make bold progress against that peak that I was just showing, and to maintain a science-based trajectory. We've gone quite large on a big carbon-focused programme through to 2030. So just working from left to right and giving you a few of the solutions and the package of work that we've done. So I guess the first thing is we've tried, before we even look at carbon, we've tried to integrate it through absolutely everything we do. So we've costed carbon in a £13.7 billion programme that we've just built. Every element of it has been carbon assessed and carbon optimised. We think we've avoided and deferred about 40%, similar to the highways example. But through the planning that we've already done and deferring and avoiding emissions in that route, and actually in our base operation through a focus on efficiency, more leakage reduction, more working with customers on how they use water, how they use sewers, how we manage our sludge management activities, we can get more efficiency. So that's all kind of baked in and integrated as the lion's share of stuff. But that really doesn't touch the size when you've got that massive growth dimension, let alone we're trying to do the opposite to that and get to 42% reduction. So therefore, we implemented and have created a quite serious package of work, a £196 million programme where carbon has been for the first time the primary driver for investment, and using some of the mechanisms that Ofwat have introduced. So we're really keen to work with them through submission last Monday through to determination next Christmas in how we can hold on to this and really embed some of this, because otherwise we simply will not be a science-based target company. It cannot. We need to start investing for carbon as a primary driver. So just to bring a few packages to light, kind of the first kind of solid package where we can act really cost effectively, technologically feasible, if I can even say it, is really a bit of a war on fossil fuels and really trying to take that out as the first rung. So a big focus on fleet. You can see there are 3 elements of that green fleet by 2028 package, particularly more and more able to deploy in the kind of light good end of the spectrum, more challenging in the heavy goods fleet. So we've got kind of a big biomethane linking with our sludge benefits, circular economies, all that kind of focus through that, and then more innovative stuff in this further reductions over here. Also on our property and on our site, we also use quite a lot of fossil fuels on our site in our operations. Then moving through into our land, we've done peatland and woodland for many years. We want to do even more. The benefits of that grow over time and really multiply and compound as they establish. This massive focus on process emissions, which is a core sector, a core issue for the whole sector. We know we've been under quantifying them and underrepresenting them. They're really baked into our wastewater infrastructure, so there's no quick fixes. But we think we've got some answers, and we know some of the other water companies do as well, to really push forward on how we measure them and therefore can manage them better within the AMP8 period by 2030. That's a real enabler, and we think as a sector, we know by 2030 we'll really be able to move forward on that kind of Achilles heel. And then recognising a bit of an adaptive approach in all of this and not knowing kind of where we are. It's really hard to predict in this cycle where we might be in 3 to 5 years with these technologies and their cost-benefit positions. We're proposing a package of work where we will chase a number of things and see which ones we can make stick in the latter part of the 5-year period to 2030. More on HGVs, more in our catchments, more on those process emissions, bringing in chemicals as a scope 3 area of our supply chain. So a really integrated package of activity, quite a bold scale and size, the most granular and advanced stuff that we've ever done. So I'm really quite excited that we can lock onto that and move forward with carbon as a primary goal for the first time. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gordon, and yeah, thank you to all of our speakers. I think there's a lot in there in those 3 presentations around some of the challenges that you face, but also a lot about the actions, the activities, the solutions that you're pursuing. So that is kind of what Carbon Crunch is all about. We recognise the scale of the challenge, but the reason of convening you all today in the room is to have those conversations and to hear about what organisations are doing in terms of the solutions. And we know that there is no single answer. And I think, Gordon, if you put a whole menu of things up there, some of which are going to work better than others, and that's hearing that message as well is really important. So thank you very much indeed to all 3 of the speakers in that section. I'm going to pass over to Denise to introduce our last speaker of the day.
Very much, Nikki. Thank you. I really appreciate that. We said it was a jam-packed session, didn't we, at the start of the day? I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm feeling quite overwhelmed now with the amount of information and learning that's taken place over the last couple of hours. And I'm not quite sure how you're going to do this, Richard, because you're our final presentation. So quite a lot of expectation now on you, helping us to understand how to navigate some of this. Rich is the former Climate Change and Sustainability Strategy Lead for the MOD. So I'm sure that you can do that, given all that you've navigated in the past. Really looking forward to hearing these insights. And then we'll be wrapping up just before lunch. Richard, thank you very much.
I don't know where I should stand, but thank you very much indeed. And thank you for inviting me. And I'd like to thank all the speakers, actually, because I have found this an absolutely fascinating session from Lord Deben. I've never heard him speak before. I've heard a lot about him. I've seen one or two things, but I've never heard him speak before. And actually, he was very compelling. But every single one of the speakers, I think, today has illustrated something which is really interesting in their own way. So what is a soldier? I've done 10 operational tours, spent 2 years in Afghanistan, gone to Iraq and all that. What's a soldier doing standing here? I'm not even an engineer. I didn't have a clue about engineering apart from common sense. Well, I suppose it goes back to, I spent 4 years as the, I suppose you could call it global HR director for defense. Had about 3.5 million people I was responsible for in one form or another. It's 5% of the country's population. And I sat on what was called the Defence Executive Committee, which was the primary executive committee of defence, as it said, with the permanent secretary and the chief of defence staff as my bosses for 4 years. And not once in that 4 years was the words climate change or sustainability mentioned. And this is something I've been interested in for quite a long time. So I just turned around and said, you're not taking it seriously. You have no idea what it's going to do to you at all. Let me write you a report. And the answer I got back was, we're exempt climate change. And technically that's true. Defence does not need to report to the Kyoto Protocol. It is exempt. Soldiers would turn around to me and say, well, we just go and do what we're told by politicians. Doesn't matter. And I sort of, I objected to that a little bit because actually we do wear different kit if we go to the Arctic than we do if we go to the desert. So actually we do pay attention to our environment just a little bit. And then the last one was, what's the relevance when wars are being fought? And sadly, since I wrote this, a second, or the number of wars that's been declared has been doubled. And there's a point to that, but actually what the Russia-Ukraine war showed was that bombing Russian oil sites and their supply chains does an awful lot of good to the opposition. So, we've gone from that, where everybody was saying, you're barking, you're mad, you don't even bother talking about it. We're not going to pay any attention to your report anyway. But if you have to, go and write it. Go on, be a little boy in the corner and write this report, which I did. To a senior champion in each command, so the Army, Navy, Air Force, the Strategic Command, a central piece, it's mentioned 68 times in the Defence Review, to NATO's Climate Change Action Plan is based on my report. 3 of their 4 are the 3 that I put out in our report. And the Pentagon, they produced a piece and they only quoted 3 references and one of them was my report. So where did that change happen and why did that change happen? Because I'm not actually a very good writer and I loathe writing. So it wasn't the report itself, probably. So I thought I'd put just sort of a couple of thoughts as to what happened and how I approached it. So the first one was working with the grain of the organization, not in the grain of the organization, is the way that I would sort of define it or try and say what it is. Soldiers like science. They like to know why they're doing things. And so just, I mean, the common theme of this morning has been water. Whether it's utilities, whether it's floods and all the rest of it. And so I was fortunate enough to spend the last week in Italy at NATO's first climate change and security research workshop, where we had some really eminent climate change scientists. And one of them was talking about water. Why is it that more rain is falling or more intense rainfall is falling? I was quoted when I produced my report as the general who insists we all have larger gutters around our houses. as a joke, but actually it's true. And there's a very good reason, as he described to. And I thought I'd just share it with you to try and explain, because I like to know why things are happening. And the simple answer is water and air react differently to increasing heat. Now, you might think that's entirely logical, but of course it does take a bit of thinking about. So with every 1 degree of heating, and actually on land, we're at about 1.5, 1.6 degrees at the moment. It is only the oceans that are keeping us under 1.5. 70% of the world's surface area is ocean. But for every 1 degree of heat, the oceans expire, i.e. water comes off the oceans at 2% more. But the air, 1 degree extra of heat, requires 7% more rain before it falls out of the sky, with 1 degree of heat extra. So what you've got is this mismatch between 2% evaporation every 1 degree and 7% falling. So the hotter we get, the distance between rainfalls is going to get bigger by 3 times. So it's going to be more and more drought. And the amount of water, we're probably overland, there's 10% more rainfall falling each time. That is why the water utilities are having such a problem. And I'm not a particular fan of the water companies, I have to say. I'm along with 99% of the rest of the country, but they do have a point. Do have a point, which is they have 19th century technology, mostly in this country, against a massively 21st century problem, which is much, much more intense rainfall. Anyway, that was just one small thing. So soldiers like to know a bit about the science, but work with the organization. So what did I concentrate on in defense? I concentrated on defense on 2 things that really, really interest defense. The first is greater capability, being better at what we do, to be the best Army, Navy, and Air Force in the world. Really straightforward. So how does climate change affect our ability to be the best Army, Navy, and Air Force in the world? And I've repeatedly said we can be the greenest Navy, the greenest Air Force, and the greenest Army in the world, but if we come second in a war, we come second in a war. And that's not what we're paid to do. We're paid to come first. We're paid to win. We're paid to protect you. And therefore, there's no point in being green and less effective. You've got to be more effective and green. So that was the first thing I concentrated on. The second thing that defense, like every other government department, is interested in is money, saving money. So I had to put the whole of my plan about climate change into those 2 simple things. How do I save money? How do I make us more effective? And who should I be persuading? Not the Chief of Defence Staff, not the ministers. They're frankly irrelevant in defence. I shouldn't say that, but I did. Unlike most government departments, I should say. I had to persuade the finance director. So as a classic example, the Army wanted to put in some solar farms, and they said, we've got this idea for some solar farms. And the finance director said, why? He said, because we'll save lots of emissions. And he said, that's not our job. Go away. No money. None. Not even 5 million for a pilot project. And they came to me and said, oh, shit, excuse me. What do we do? So I said, well, you've just answered it in a completely, utterly the wrong way. So they went back to the finance director and said, we've got this really good idea, solar farms. And he said, why should we do that? I said, there's 2 reasons. One reason is the government has predicted that we will run out of electricity in this country on our current trajectory by 2035. Because if you make electricity pay for or be used for all our vehicles, all our heat, everything that we do will be electrified. We don't have enough, which is why the government is trying to push so much down nuclear, trying to push so much down offshore wind, or why they want to massively increase the renewables, because we're going to run out of electricity if everybody has a heat pump in their house. It's as simple as that. And so actually, if the Army ran out of electricity, it would be a little bit embarrassing. So it's about resilience. And the second reason is, of course, it saves money. There's an upfront cost, we accept that, but actually it saves money in the long run. And I'm now being paid because of the solar panels on my house. I happen to be being paid by the electricity companies. They probably hate me. Every year I make a massive profit. So it's about persuading the finance director, but the other person it's about persuading is the operator. So the way to persuade the operator is to turn around and say, and this is a sad statistic, But a number of statistics. First of all, the most senior British officer killed in Afghanistan was on a logistic patrol. He happened to be an infantryman, a guy called Lieutenant Colonel Rupert Thornley, and he was killed leading his infantry battalion to protect fuel going to Helmand. So actually, not only is it a loss of life, which is tragic, that fuel, by the way, we think cost around about £200 a litre, more or less, to get to Helmand because of all the things you had to put on to make sure it got down the road to Helmand. And then you've taken away the infantry who should be fighting the Taliban just to protect fuel. So actually, if we can find a way of using less fuel by solar panels, by perhaps a micronuclear reactor, which Rolls-Royce is looking at, then actually, isn't that a better way of using our people? Isn't that a better way of using our equipment? So the operators got it immediately and said, we want some of this. We will go everywhere we can to try and make sure we reduce our fuel. And by the way, if you have enough electricity, and a micronuclear reactor will do this, you can create water. You can create sustainable aviation fuel. You can do all sorts of things if you have enough electricity. So as opposed to just diesel generators, we've gone for self-sustainability. And sort of finally in this sort of area, we've got electrification. I don't know how many of you have electric cars. I'm not going to ask for a sort of poll. I happen to have an electric car. I love driving it. It is the fastest car I've ever driven. It is just smooth as anything, and it's great fun. It also has 330 miles, which makes it really brilliant. But anyway, we've put electric drives in a lot of our vehicles. Now, we can't make an electric tank. It just doesn't exist. But we can put electric drives in with the diesel engine to fill the electric drive. Electric drives are far better. We can now do 360s in our tanks. We can now do 360s in any vehicle you care for. We can now go off-road far better than we used to be able to. The drivers say it's like driving a golf buggy, so they don't get into quite so many accidents. It's just better. And then you have, on the battery, a silent, completely silent mode, which means that the enemy can't find you. No emissions, no heat signature, no noise signature. So it's better tactically. That's what is a good thing for the MOD. So the first thing was work within the grain of the organization. Second is identify quick wins. Really, really straightforward. You've got to start somewhere. Don't put it off saying, oh, I haven't got all the things. Don't even worry. I would argue, forgive me, I'm going to be very controversial here. Don't even worry about having perfect data. Some companies will demand perfect data before they move at all. So no, don't worry about perfect data. Get on with it. And your data will come later because you will learn more about how the data works if you just get on with it. So what are we doing with that? I said start with the estate because the technology already exists. We've got 100,000 buildings in defence. To put that into perspective, we would have to make net zero 3,000 buildings a day, and it would take 100 years. Sorry, 3,000 buildings a week, and it would take 100 years to get all our buildings right. So this is a massive problem for us. But if you don't start, you'll never get there. So start on the estate. We joined the Jet Zero Council. The Royal Air Force has said that they're going to be net zero by 2040, and they're actively looking at sustainable aviation fuel. And the interesting thing about that is I turned around to them and said, you know what, the Royal Air Force doesn't use a huge amount of fuel compared to British Airways or Ryanair or something like that. And they turned around and said, that's fine. We may not have the volume, but we're government, we pay, and we've got reputation. So it's worth us doing it because others will follow. And we now have 44 countries around the world following the Royal Air Force to get to net zero by 2040. That's the power of leadership. And that's what it's worth doing. And we built a green network in defence, harnessing the youth, harnessing those who are interested, and the power of the willing. And by building that green network, we encouraged and we supported. And the final thing is, I was always very worried about the fact that it was all about me. It was my report. I was driving it. I was actually asked to implement it, and I turned around and said, no, I'm not going to implement it. You gave me no support in writing it. You'll give me no support if you ask me to implement it. So I'm going to resign, which I did. And I said, but that's not the end of it. I want you to build a small team in defence to replace me. So 16 people in defence whose sole job is to do this. 16 out of 250,000, not very many. But actually their sole job as they work at departmental level is to keep ministers and to keep the senior civil servants on the button on keeping to net zero. The third thing is something that Lord Deben said very quickly, which was, I'll put different phrase on it, it's been said before, use a sustainability lens in everything that you look at. And in a sense, the Cllr Thames crossing is a fantastic example of using the sustainability lens in everything you look at. So the way that I did that is some what ifs. Working through digital twins. What if your supply chain had no access to oil anymore? What would you do differently? What would your supply chain do differently? Now, it's not going to happen. There's not going to be no oil. Just Stop Oil is not going to win this side of 2050 and probably not this side of 2070, in my view. But if you ask the question, what's going to happen if you took oil out of everything you did? What would you do to replace to keep your company going? What would you do to replace to keep your ideas going, your purpose going? Think about it, and you might come up with some really interesting solutions. And we came up with one. We built some near net zero transit accommodation. So for those on field exercises on Salisbury Plain, we built some near net zero buildings. There's a company called Reds 10. They're a wonderful construction company. And it was near net zero. And I went up to the managing director. I was there at the opening of them, all very successful, well done. And I said to him, having looked around, there's an awful lot of embedded carbon in this building. Do you think you could do better? And it was the sort of thing that senior officers say all the time, tend not to be noticed, and tend to sort of be oh, poor boy, he doesn't really know what he's talking about. But not this managing director. So I was asked to open the second lot of buildings up in a place called Nestcliff near Shrewsbury. And he bounded up to me, the managing director bounded up to me and said, we've reduced the embedded carbon by 1/3. And we did it by looking at every single material in this building and said, could we do it with less carbon? And of course, carbon is money, because embedded carbon is just the energy it requires to build that particular material. So he got rid of the steel basins and the steel loos. Why were they there? Oh, because soldiers don't know how to behave. Funnily enough, and put porcelain in, which is less carbon intensive. And guess what? Porcelain is cheaper because you can buy it down at B&Q. You can't buy a steel basin down at B&Q quite so easily. The whole building was so much cheaper that he put all the extra money, it was a fixed price contract, he put all the extra money into solar panels and into circulation systems in the building. What's the effect? It's now a net negative building. It gives back more than it takes. And there's no maintenance costs. There's no energy costs at all for that building. It was cheaper to go for better materials. So, and I'll give one other example. Water. We've been talking about water a lot. But if there is more water going to come down, and you use water in your systems, why don't you build a water tank as opposed to giving it all to the utilities to deal with in overflow? If every single house had a water tank and then used it, wouldn't that be better? But perhaps that's just me. But what we do is we look all the time in the MOD at new technologies, trying to get new technologies and understand what those new technologies offer us. And they won't all be relevant to the MOD, but they might just be relevant to our estate, and it's worth looking at it. So what's the result? We have a federated system in the MOD. Actually, the Army, Navy, and Air Force have all their own budgets. They now all have their own champions. They're all now going down a slightly different route. Does that matter? And I would argue that it's slightly incoherent, but it doesn't matter. So what's the best that can come from that? The best that can come from that is lots of ideas, enthused staff, initiative and innovation. What's the worst that can come out of that? Well, it's not 100% efficient. Does that matter at this stage? And I would argue allowing people the freedom to do what they want to do is far better than top-down directed efficiency. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Richard. I have written down here another insightful contribution. What I really want to say is I'm so pleased personally you didn't accept that the forces aren't exempt from climate change. I think the leadership you've shown there in tackling the challenges is absolutely outstanding. And I'd also like to thank all of you in the room today for joining in the discussions and those through the live stream, whether that's been in the roundtable discussions or through making presentations. Cathy opened the event by outlining the need for us to work collaboratively, as well as the critical role the private sector must play in delivering on carbon net zero. Watching everyone come together for our table discussions, where you've shared your challenges and done that in a really frank way, certainly around our table, there's some quite frank sharing, and also where the opportunities are. I did get a real sense of the willingness of everybody here to cooperate, and a recognition that we need to do that at pace. And in order to do that, we can't always wait for permission. Andrew, that was one of the points that came across really strongly from you. The need for sustained collaboration across the whole supply chain to effectively deliver carbon net zero and infrastructure resilience and adaptation has come through loud and clear in the presentations. The speakers, I think, have been absolutely outstanding. I'm not going to do that kind of blow-by-blow account of then so-and-so said and then somebody else said. But I would like to remind everybody of what Lord Deben said, because it feels like it was quite a while ago now, doesn't it? We've been taking on board so much information. He closed. I'm not going to repeat some of his more controversial points, but he closed with 3 key points, didn't he? To us as a group. He said, we have to use our professionalism. You have knowledge and expertise that can really drive this agenda forward. Use our political influence. 9 people at least in the room are doing that already. Wouldn't it be great if everybody else was? And also be a leader. Don't look around the room and expect somebody else to be taking action. You all have the opportunity to be taking action and to be a leader yourselves. The cities panel. Claire, thank you ever so much, and thank you to the panelists for that, because it really dug into what I see as a really knotty area. A lot of these challenges, if you sort of boil them down, you know, a city has all of it going on at once, doesn't it? Water, energy, you know, transport, it's all happening in that space. So really appreciated hearing firsthand of the challenges. The project focus, the organisational focus, and then, as I say, Richard, it was really great to hear about your experiences in driving a change through what is an incredibly large and complex organisation. So going back to the beginning, we started Carbon Crunch 10 years ago in 2013 as a place to bring the industry together, a safe space to share ideas, concerns and challenges, and to explore the opportunities to reduce carbon. And this year's event has definitely continued that process. But although we have come a long way over the last decade, there's still a lot more to do. So we'd like you to join our, not just ours as Mott MacDonald, ours as a collaborative net zero industry coalition. We've been working with Anglian Water, Skanska, St Masons, Leeds City Council, National Grid and Transport for London as part of that coalition for a number of years now. We formalised collaboration on the Carbon Net Zero Challenge across the supply chain and infrastructure industry. And we know that together we can continue to build a really strong network that shares in the way that we've been doing this morning. We'll provide you with the opportunity to influence project concepts in areas that are specific to your needs and make a significant impact on the UK's journey to net zero. So please do become a member. There's information available to you. So I'm now between you and lunch. I really do hope you'll stay to join us, because there's been very limited opportunity for sort of Q&A from the platform. The speakers are all broadly in kind of that part of the room. So do feel free to go grab somebody. I'm sure that's all right. You might need to sort of walk through to lunch with them as you do it. Keep those connections going, and use the opportunity over lunch to make new connections if you haven't already. Thank you very much for joining us today. I've certainly enjoyed it.